Princess Who Had Everything. Read by June Whitfield.
Once upon a time, there was a princess who had all the gifts you could possibly want, and one that you most decidedly wouldn't. The trouble began, as trouble usually did, once upon a time, at her christening. The statutory invitations were sent to all the fairies in the land to act as fairy godmothers. Suitable gifts gratefully received was not actually printed on the cards, but that was the general idea. "It's not what you know, it's who you know," murmured the Queen as she handed over the list to her lady-in-waiting. The lady-in-waiting, who had a date with a handsome courtier, dashed off the invitations with one eye on the sundial and didn't waste time checking whether the Queen had included all the fairies, which was unfortunate because she hadn't. She'd got as far as the fairy Utopia when she had been called away to speak to the plumber about the blocked moat. And when she'd got back, she'd turned over 2 pages and began on the W's. Acceptances came winging back from the fairies. But there was one exception. The fairy Glamorella never replied. "Oh, well, we all know Glamorella," sniffed the Queen. "She's probably swanned off to the sun again and is lying stark naked on the deck of some Dago's yacht in the Sapphire Sea." As he pictured this vision, the King had to swallow several times to stop his Adam's apple slipping its anchor. But when he'd got it under control, he just nodded and murmured, "Not very reliable, Glamorella," to which the Queen made the sort of noise that spelled, "Humph." But when the christening day came and the fairies flustered round the cradle, it seemed that it was not only Glamorella who was missing, it was the fairy Sunshine who threw the monkey wrench into the works. "Why, look," she said brightly. "Dear Vinaigrette isn't here." A gasp of consternation went round the room, with the King gasping loudest of all. He knew what offending a fairy meant, not only in good, hard, solid, materialistic terms, but in the kind of revenge they were capable of. "Surely you haven't forgotten Vinaigrette of all fairies?" he demanded. The Queen turned a whiter shade of pale and clutched his arm. "Oh, my crown," she faltered. "I do believe I did. Whatever can we do?" "We'll send a carriage for her straight away and pretend the invitation got lost in the postal strike. She won't believe it, but she can't very well say anything." "Knowing Vinaigrette, she probably can," said the Queen despondently. "Enjoy yourselves, my dears," she called to the other fairies. "There'll just be the tiniest delay before the present-giving, the christening ceremony, I mean." And the fairies hung around glumly watching the corners of the sandwiches on the buffet curl at the edges as they awaited Vinaigrette's arrival. When she finally entered, very upright, with clicking footsteps and a steely glint in her eye, she brushed aside the King and Queen's apologies. "No matter, my dears," she said with an acid smile. "These things will happen. Such a pity, though, that I haven't had time to think up a really delicious gift for your little darling. I'll just have to rely on the inspiration of the moment." And flashing them a look which would have carved through armour plating at 20 paces, she took her place at the end of the fairy line-up. The King and Queen eyed each other apprehensively, and even the other fairies looked a bit uneasy as the ceremony began. The baby was duly christened Beatrice, after the Queen's mother, and then, one by one, the fairies waved their wands over her and unleashed a list of gifts that would have turned even King Midas emerald with envy. As Vinaigrette's turn came nearer and nearer, the King and Queen shifted more and more uneasily on their thrones, and then, just after Fairy Wisteria had given the princess the gift of loving flowers, which the King thought a bit on the mean side, Vinaigrette finally minced forward, posed with her wand poised, while all the fairies froze with foreboding. The wand suddenly cut a couple of swift curves over the cradle. Vinaigrette gave a lynx-like smile, and in a voice dripping with saccharine said, "Since you will love flowers, I give you the gift of having flowers grow where'er you walk." There was a moment of silence, And then the whole court made the kind of noise people make when they watch a rocket burst. "Ah!" they all cooed in unison. Then, "How sweet!" said the sugar-plum fairy. "How forgiving!" said the court chaplain. "How damn silly!" said the king. But he felt distinctly relieved just the same. The only discordant note was struck by the royal nanny, who said disapprovingly, "It'll make for a very untidy nursery." In the 2 years that followed, the baby princess led the totally satisfactory life of a baby who has all the gifts that anyone could possibly want. Locomotively, she progressed in an exemplary fashion, first flailing about on her stomach, then sliding around on her bottom, and finally achieving a fairly efficient crawl. Then came the never-to-be-forgotten day when the under-nursery maid came running into the throne room. "Oh, come quickly, your majesties," she puffed. "We think the baby is going to take her first step." The king and queen flew out onto the front lawn just in time to see the royal nanny let go of the hand of the princess, who took one wobbly pace forward and then sat down again. But lo, where she had trodden, a marigold sprang up in full flower. "Oh, how perfectly sweet," squealed the queen. "From now on we'll call her Marigold in honour of her first flower." "Thank God," murmured the king, who never liked the name Beatrice on account of its close associations with his mother-in-law. "Lucky, though," he added reflectively, "that her first flower wasn't a bogwort." By now, all the courtiers were gathered round in an admiring circle, and the baby, drunk with power, staggered 3 more steps, producing a hollyhock, a pansy, and a red-hot poker. And the courtiers all applauded, whereupon the royal nanny, saying, "This'll only end in tears," scooped the baby up and bundled her back to the nursery, leaving the king gazing at his flower-strewn lawn. As Princess Marigold began to walk more and more, the wage demands of the enraged royal gardeners reached astronomical proportions as they battled to remove flowers not only from the croquet lawn, the bowling green, and the tennis courts, but also from the gravel paths and paved terraces as well. Fairy Vinaigrette hadn't said anything about flowers growing only in earth. She promised flowers where'er you walk, and by golly, she was sticking to her promise. Inside the palace, the footmen were getting fed up with having to fly-mow the floors and scythe the stairs, and even the queen pronounced herself not amused when Marigold pattered over her priceless new Persian rug, leaving a trail of dandelions woven into the warp. In less time than it takes to say herbaceous border, the royal family and the whole court had become considerably disenchanted with Marigold's christening present. "Oh, we might as well set up as a garden centre," grumbled the king gloomily, as he stood gazing one day at what had been the 18th green of the court golf course, and now looked more like a contender for the first prize at the Royal Horticultural Society's annual show. At that moment, the royal nanny burst into the throne room in a dudgeon which couldn't have been higher. "I wish to hand in my notice," she stated. "I cannot stay in this palace any longer. I was just dancing baby on my knee this morning. And look!" She hoisted up her skirts to reveal a clump of crocuses blossoming on each knee, one purple, one yellow. Whilst she was rushed rapidly off to the head gardener to be treated with weed killer, the king and queen went into a panic-stricken huddle. "Something must be done," wailed the queen. "Yes, but what?" said the king. "You know that fairies' christening gifts can never be taken away, not even by other fairies. Sometimes they can be counteracted by another gift, but there aren't any fairies left to give her anything, except Glamorella, and Fairyland alone knows where she is." At that moment there was a brilliant flash of light at the throne room door, and Glamorella swept in a cloud of stardust, wrapped in white fox furs, and looking more like Marlene Dietrich than Marlene Dietrich ever did. "Did I hear my name?" she cooed. "Darlings, how divine to see you again. I just got back from the Sapphire Sea, and I found your invitation. I do hope I'm not too late for the christening." "Marigold had her 3rd birthday 4 months ago," said the Queen somewhat tartly. "There you are, darlings. It just shows how time flies when you're enjoying yourself," said Glamorella. "Oh, this is Fernando, by the way," she added, clutching the arm of a tall, darkly brooding young man who had followed her in. "He has the most gorgeous yacht and beautiful biceps, but he doesn't seem to speak any English. In fact, I haven't found out yet what language he does speak. Run along, my pet," she went on, giving him a push. "The grown-ups are going to have a powwow." And settling herself in the most comfortable chair, said, "Now, tell me all that's happened since I last saw you." So they told her about Marigold. "Oh, my darlings," she screamed, "how too frightful for you. Why ever didn't you send for me?" "We've sent telegrams all over Fairyland," said the Queen sharply, "and they've all come back marked flown away." "Well, yes, I have been a mite mobile, but if you're following the sun, why not keep going, I always say." "Glamorella, you really do lead the most raffish life," said the Queen, more in envy than in sorrow, "and I don't really think you're fit to be anybody's godmother. However, you do bring a sparkle of gaiety to our lives whenever we happen to see you. And now," she finished, getting down to gold tacks, "what can you do about Marigold?" Glamorella pondered. "I think, darlings," she crooned, "that it might help if I could just have the teeniest, weeniest glass of giggle juice. It stimulates the magicites, you know." The King hastened over to the court cocktail cabinet, and Glamorella called after him, "Stirred, not shaken, darling, and not too teeny-weeny," she added rather anxiously. When he returned with a brimming crystal goblet, she took a sip, and then, relaxing into the uttermost depths of the armchair, she flashed a dazzling smile round the throne room. "But of course, my dears, it's really all too simple," she purred. "Send the pretty child to me. She is pretty, I trust," she added with a shade of apprehension. "Of course, dear. She was given the gift of beauty by the fairy Avon." "Ah, yes," murmured Glamorella, "the name rings a bell." "And here she is, then," she cooed, as Marigold entered in the arms of the royal nanny. "Come to your fairy godmother. Well, no, on second thoughts perhaps not, dear," she went on, with a wary eye on Marigold's feet. And from her diamond-studded reticule she produced a small telescopic stick, which at the flick of a switch opened up into a full-length magic wand. "So much more practical than those cumbersome old-fashioned ones," she murmured. "One never knew where to put them. And now," she continued, with a dramatic flourish of the wand, "my darling child, I give you the gift that where'er you walk, a short, sharp frost will follow." A gasp of admiration rose from the assembled court.
"What a perfectly splendid idea," said the King. "But won't it kill off everything else?"
"Oh, no, my sweet. It'll be very slight. Just for a split second behind her heels, there'll be a little nip in the air, as the man said before he pushed the Japanese off a cliff," she added, with a peal of laughter, which the King thought of as bell-like, and the Queen would have called a trifle shrill. "Really, Glamorella," she said reprovingly, "you mustn't be rude about the Japanese." "But I wouldn't dream of being rude about the dear Japanese. I mean, some of my best friends are."
"They won't be for long,"
said the King. "But of course not for long, my sweet. All the poor darling Japanese are terribly short. Didn't you know?" At this point, Glamorella glimpsed Fernando peering round a pillar and exclaimed, "I think the native is getting restless. I'll have to leave you, my pets." And clutching Fernando's arm, she swept out into the waiting carriage. "Pity she dyes her hair that colour," said the Queen as she waved into the distance. "It makes her look so much older." The King opened his mouth to say something, caught the Queen's eye, and shut it again. A diversion was caused by the royal nanny, who'd followed them out of the palace with the princess in her arms. She plonked her down on the grass, and a hush fell as the entire court held its collective breath, waiting for Marigold's first step. She put her foot forward. A small green shoot shot up, instantly withered and disappeared. She took a second, third, and fourth step, and there wasn't a flower to be seen. "She's cured!" cried the Queen. "Oh, what a wonderful friend dear Glamorella is! Now we can all live happily ever after." And apart from Marigold's slight tendency to chilblains round the heels, that's exactly what they did.
A Tale of Two Frogs, read by Anton Rodgers.
Once upon a time, there was a king who had two daughters. Or, to be strictly accurate, he had a daughter and a stepdaughter. And if you know anything about stories which begin once upon a time, you'll already be taking sizable bets that his real daughter was pretty, sweet, and gentle, and that his stepdaughter was a nasty bit of work, and ugly with it. And you'll be on an odds-on winner. King Phosphorus's real daughter, Princess Prunella, besides being pretty, was also obedient, dutiful, and kind. She even tried to be kind to her stepsister, Princess Gorgonzola, which was pretty uphill work, because Gorgonzola not only had a face that would close down a factory at 20 paces, but she had a character to match. And at the drop of a coronet would go off moaning to her mother to complain about Prunella. Queen Griselda was not exactly a wicked stepmother, but she was the next worst thing. Disagreeable, greedy, and with a nature so acid you could have used it to cure wasp stings. So whenever Gorgonzola came whinging to her that Prunella had had a fuller glass of nectar or a larger slice of ambrosia, she would rush off and thump on King Phosphorus's study door and demand retribution. The king, whose only interest in life was his stamp collection, would murmur, Yes, my dear, yes, I'll see to it." And Griselda would continue to thump and scream until he would reluctantly tear himself away from his Illyrian penny blacks and tidy up his Never-Never-Land purple triangulars and shuffle off in search of Princess Prunella. Together they'd have a cosy little chat about the weather and what might win the King Cophetua Stakes, if the going was good. Then Phosphorus would potter back to his study, and Prunella would rub her eyes very hard to look as though she'd been crying, and creep back to her room under the beady gaze of Gorgonzola and Griselda. As these outbursts became more and more frequent, Prunella became more and more fed up. Her eyes were getting positively bloodshot from so much rubbing, and as she never seemed to be able to please her stepmother and sister, she decided the only way to escape them was to get married. This was easier said than done, because although eligible princes were often invited to the palace, however longingly their eyes might stray to Prunella, it was always made perfectly plain to them that Gorgonzola, being the elder, had to be got off the shelf first. Then Prunella had a great idea. Now, in all honesty, it must be said that although Prunella was sweet, kind, and gentle, she was also not very bright. So it wasn't really surprising that her great idea was to find a handsome prince who'd been turned into a frog, turn him back again, and elope with him. With this end in view, she took to spending all her free time by the pond at the bottom of the palace garden, trying to chat up the frog spawn. Not unnaturally, she didn't have a great deal of success, and there was no marked improvement in the conversational give and take when the frog spawn became tadpoles. And even Princess Prunella was beginning to lose faith in her great idea, and then one day, when she arrived rather dejectedly at the pond, lo, all the tadpoles had turned into frogs, and were hopping about all over the place. Princess Prunella, selecting one she thought particularly handsome, sat down and began to ply him with questions. "What is your name?" she asked. "And who gave you that name? And what kingdom do you come from?" Reasonably enough, she got no reply. But nothing daunted, she chattered on, until another frog, who was sitting on a nearby stone and watching her sardonically, broke into her monologue. "It's no good talking to him," said this second frog. "He can't speak English." Now, you or I might have been a shade disconcerted by this phenomenon, but to dear, dim-witted Princess Prunella, it all seemed perfectly natural. "Oh," she squealed, "how wonderful! You really can't speak." "So can I," said a third frog, not to be outdone. And Princess Prunella was so overwhelmed with joy that she scooped the third frog up in the palm of her hand and kissed the top of his head, whereupon the frog broke into a great big grin. "I say," he exclaimed, "you've broken the spell." "You mean," said Prunella eagerly, "that you're really a handsome prince who's been turned into a frog by a sorcerer's magic?" "That's the ticket," said the third frog. "There's a wizard over at Nether Wackington with a frightfully limited range, so whenever he runs out of ideas, he just goes back to turning handsome princes into frogs. There's dozens of us, all hanging about waiting to be kissed by princesses so that we can turn back again. Not," he added with a marked lack of humility, "that they're all quite as handsome as I am." "You really had quite a bit of luck singling me out." The second frog snorted at this and said, "It's all a matter of taste, mate. You're not exactly Robert Redford, you know, and there's a chap 3 ponds away who, in my opinion, makes you look like Ken Dodd. Please don't think," he added quickly, turning to Prunella, "that I'm gay or anything. It's just that I've got an artistic eye." "Of course not," beamed Prunella, who was so dim that she didn't know what he was talking about. "Oh, and I do apologise to you. It seems a bit unfair that I actually kissed him, because I saw you first. I'm afraid it was just the excitement." "Think nothing of it," he said. "No hard feelings. It's like I always say, you win some, you lose some. Oh, the name's Ferdinand, by the way," he added, "and if I can be of any assistance to you two, just drop me the word." "How kind you are," gushed Prunella. "I'm sure we can get along splendidly now. But why?" she went on a bit anxiously. "Now that I've kissed him, doesn't it go on and turn back into a handsome prince?" "Ah, yes, well, there's a bit more to it than that," said the third frog. "Oh, and by the way, my name is Prince Charming. Bit hackneyed, I'm afraid, but eldest son and all that. Had to be named after the pater, you know. Unfortunately, the family's a bit trad, but rich," he went on quickly, in case Prunella was cooling off. "Anyway, I was going to explain. When you kissed me, you broke the spell. But I won't actually turn back into a handsome prince. Well, moderately handsome," he corrected himself, catching Ferdinand's eye upon him, "until you've married me and kissed me on our wedding night. After that, you can kiss that dragonfly over there and it'll turn back into my horse. Then we'll ride off into my kingdom and live happily ever after." It all sounds a bit complicated, I'm afraid, but it actually does work, because the same thing happened to one of my cousins, and he's been happily married for ages now, with 3 offsprings. "All children," he added hastily, "not frogs." "Is that all right with you?" he inquired anxiously. "Of course it is," burbled Prunella. "But I'll have to fly now," she sighed, "because I can hear the dinner gong ringing, and if I'm late, they'll come to look for me. I'll be back just as soon as I can." And so saying, she danced off into the palace. The first person she met there was Gorgonzola. And because she was brimming over with joy, and because she really was remarkably stupid, she babbled out the whole story to her. Gorgonzola's eyes went snap, crackle, and pop, and she seized Prunella by the wrist. "When does this wedding take place?" she hissed. Thick as she was, Prunella realised she had been somewhat indiscreet, and tried to flannel a bit. "Oh, well, we haven't named the day yet," she said airily. "And you won't tell anyone, will you?" she finished up anxiously. "I won't tell a soul," snapped Gorgonzola, and she meant it. She had every intention of going down to the pond at first light and nobbling Prince Charming for herself. What she hadn't realised was that Prunella would go straight back to the pond after dinner. Charming was on the lookout for her, and she sat down beside him and rattled on about Gorgonzola. You won't breathe a word to her about us, will you?" said Charming. "But I've already told her," said Prunella. "In that case," he said, "we'd better not hang about. We can't wait for a human parson. We'll have to make do with the local toad. It's all perfectly legal. He's a justice of the peace. He marries all the frogs round here. Is that all right?" "Oh, but of course," beamed Prunella, who would quite happily have been married by a mushroom if she'd been told to. So the toad was hastily dragged from the bottom of the pond, with Ferdinand and the dragonfly as witnesses. Then Prunella kissed her frog bridegroom, and he instantly turned into a handsome prince. Well, anyway, fairly handsome. Then she kissed the dragonfly, who turned into a beautiful white charger, and they rode off at speed towards the castle wall. Unfortunately, as the dragonfly had for so long been used to having wings, he quite forgot to jump, which caused rather a disaster at the first attempt, but after a couple more refusals, they eventually soared up over the castle wall and rode off into the sunset, to live happily ever after. Whereupon Ferdinand yawned, shut his eyes, and fell asleep on his stone. He was awoken at dawn by a sharp prod of someone's foot in his ribs. He opened his eyes and saw Gorgonzola bending over him. "Wake up!" screeched Gorgonzola. "I want some help. I'm looking for a frog that talks." "Well, I talk," said Ferdinand, and almost before the words had left his mouth, Gorgonzola had scooped him up with a scream of joy, kissed him on the top of his head, and said, "Will you marry me?" Ferdinand looked her up and down, shuddered again, and said, "What's in it for me?" "Well," said Gorgonzola, "the palace is awfully comfortable, and we dine off gold plates every night. And as I'm the oldest daughter, I can probably wangle it so that you'll be king one day." "OK, it's a deal," said Ferdinand. "When do we ankle up the aisle?" "Just as soon as Mummy can arrange it," said Gorgonzola, and she bustled off to burst into the Queen's boudoir. "I'm engaged to be married," she announced, and the Queen jumped with joy. "Oh, my darling child," she exclaimed, "who's the lucky man?" "Well, actually, it's a frog," said Gorgonzola. After she'd revived the Queen from her faint by the simple expedient of chucking a bucket of cold water over her, Gorgonzola explained the situation, and by the end of her recital, Griselda's eyes were glinting greedily. "But this is splendid news, my dear," she said. "You must be married immediately. In the circumstances, though, I think a quiet wedding would be best. So I don't think we'll bother dear Papa. You run along and fetch your fiancé, and I'll line up the court chaplain." The court chaplain was old and short-sighted, but not so old and short-sighted that he didn't know a frog when he saw one. And when Ferdinand came hopping up the aisle, he staggered back a bit and hastily shuffled through the pages of the prayer book, which tell you that you can't marry your cousin's aunt's stepfather. However, there didn't seem to be anything about frogs there, so he braced himself and got on with the service, only hesitating briefly over, "Do you take this frog to be your wedded husband?" Once he had pronounced them frog and wife, Gorgonzola grabbed Ferdinand, rushed hotfoot for her bedroom, plonked him on the pillow and kissed him. "I say," he protested, "I wish you wouldn't keep doing that. It's a terrible shock to the system." But the Princess Gorgonzola wasn't really listening. She was just gazing at him expectantly, and Ferdinand gazed back unblinkingly. "Well, go on then," said Gorgonzola impatiently. "Why don't you get on with it?" "Get on with what?" asked the frog. "When are you going to turn into a handsome prince?" demanded Gorgonzola even more impatiently. "A prince?" echoed Ferdinand. "Have you got bananas? How can I turn into a prince? I'm a frog, not a quick-change artist." "No, but you're really a handsome prince who's been turned into a frog by a wicked wizard," said Gorgonzola, with a touch of anxiety. "Course I'm not," said Ferdinand shortly. "I'm just a frog. Surely even you can see that." "But you can talk," said Gorgonzola with gathering alarm. "Well, that's not so difficult. A mate of mine taught me down in the pond. Now, he was a prince. Only last night, gorgeous bit of crumpet came and broke the spell and married him. Some people have all the luck," he added with a depressed air. "Do you mean," she screeched, "do you actually mean," she continued on a rising crescendo, so piercing that all the workers in the gossamer factory 10 miles away downed tools and knocked off because they thought it was the siren. "Can you possibly mean," she screamed, "that I'm actually married to a frog?" "Looks like it, old fruit," croaked Ferdinand. "It's like I always say, you win some, you lose some. You've made your bed, now you've got to lie on it. Oh, and speaking of which, all this excitement has made me a bit tired. I think I'll turn in now. Tell you what," he added, gazing round appreciatively, "these satin sheets are a bit of all right. Comfort-wise, they beat pond slime all ends up." And he flopped back on the pillows and fell asleep. At which point, the Princess Gorgonzola said a very, very rude word.
The Princess Who Lost Her Marbles, read by Prunella Scales.
Once upon a time, which may be a hackneyed way to begin a fairy story, but if you can think of a better one, I'd be interested to know it, there was a king who had 3 daughters who were called Princess What's-Her-Name, Princess Whatchamacaller, and Princess Thingamajig. The king was King Fredobert the Forgetful. Well, actually, his names were Frederick Olivier Bertram, but as he constantly forgot them, the Queen found it easier to shorten it to Fredobert, which he occasionally remembered. In the same way that she decided it would be simpler to give her daughters the kind of names that their father was likely to call them anyway, rather than ordinary ones which he was bound to forget. Their family life was smooth and happy, apart from the occasional complications caused by King Fredobert's small lapses of memory, such as the time he forgot to give the order to lower the castle drawbridge when he was expecting a neighbouring king and his entourage to arrive late on a dark, moonless night, and the whole lot rode straight into the moat, or the time he assured Queen Matilda that he would see to everything when they went off on a 6-months royal tour, only to find when they returned the daily papers stacked halfway up the castle walls and bottles of sour milk stretching for 7 leagues outside the castle gates. It would, of course, have been perfectly possible for the Grand Vizier or the Master of the Rolls or any one of Fredobert's hundreds of servants to have taken action to correct these little aberrations, but they never did, because the king, while normally of a placid disposition, had a fiery temper when roused, and hated to be reminded of his forgetfulness. In fact, he would never, ever admit to it, and so went happily through life, keeping appointments on the wrong days, and holding royal investiture ceremonies dressed only in his crown and pyjama bottoms. The Queen would occasionally argue with the courtiers that they could easily correct such lapses as forgetting to cancel the milk without him realizing it, because he would undoubtedly have forgotten that he hadn't done it himself. The courtiers, however, weren't risking anything. They knew on which side their angel cake was frosted, because at the slightest excuse, King Fredobert was liable to dock their wages for 6 months, and one of his assets as an employer was that he was extremely wealthy, even for a king. In fact, behind his back he was familiarly known to his subjects as Fredobert the Filthy Rich. Thus it was that the 3 princesses were brought up in the lap of luxury and played unthinkingly with toys that would have made other children's ears drop off with envy. In particular, King Fredobert insisted on giving each of them a christening present of eye-popping proportions. "Gotta give the gal a good start in life," he said, as each successive princess was born. So the christening present of the eldest, Princess What's-Her-Name, was a skipping rope made of matching pearls from the most exotic oyster beds of the Orient, while Princess Whatchamacaller had a solid gold cup and ball, which actually led to having a slightly crooked nose, because whenever she threw up the ball and failed to catch it, it would fall with a clonk on her nose, and the weight was considerable. As for the youngest, the Princess Thingamajig, she was given a set of marbles made of a variety of perfectly rounded precious stones, and she would sit cross-legged in the courtyard, shooting diamonds, emeralds, rubies and sapphires at each other with a flick of her thumb. But despite these lavish launching presents, King Fredobert on the whole was careful with his money. In fact, people who were fond of him admitted that he was what you might call a bit close, and people who didn't like him said flat out that he was mean. "Look after the gold," he was fond of saying, "and the platinum will look after itself." So, having pushed the boat out for the princesses, he still kept a jolly keen eye on the presents he'd given them, even until they were grown up. Indeed, the court psychiatrist was often moved to observe that it was a jolly rum fact that despite his dodgy memory, the one thing King Fredobert never forgot was what he had given people and the price he'd paid for it. So whenever there were visitors to the castle, he would say to the princesses, "Show your christening presents to the king," or the emperor, or Auntie Flo, or whoever the visitor might be. And in that way he made sure that none of the princesses had popped them at the palace pawnbrokers when they were hard up for a bit of ready cash. Which made it all the more of a catastrophe when the Princess Thingamajig lost hers. This happened when she was 18, and she had taken to playing with her jewel marbles rather a lot because she was lonely, since her two sisters were no longer satisfactory companions to her. The Princess What's-her-name had been married for a year to a handsome prince known as "that young fellow, my lad," to Fredobert, and had a baby princess of her own, and all she could prattle about were nappies and carrycots and wind and gripe water and potties, and Princess Thingamajig found it all intensely boring. The Princess Whatchamacaller wasn't much better, for she was in love with a young prince who Fredobert called "Hey, you," and she mooned around all day, sighing and blushing, and generally being, in Thingamajig's words, wet as a dish rag and totally loopy. Someone who is wet as a dish rag and totally loopy is not a very stimulating companion for an 18-year-old princess, so Thingamajig had taken to going for long solitary walks in the forest, humming tunelessly as she went. And then one day, disaster struck. She went walking in the forest as usual, humming tunelessly as she went as usual, and when she came to a clearing she thought she'd stop, and out of sheer boredom she'd practice shooting her marbles. So she put her hand in her pocket, and there they were, gone. She abruptly stopped humming, which was a great relief to the surrounding wildlife, upon whose nerves it was beginning to grate horribly. She gave a loud screech, which made the wildlife groan again, and went dashing back to the palace to look for them. "I must have forgotten to put them in my pocket," she thought. "Great balls of fire, I suppose I've inherited Papa's little problem." But when she poured out her problems to the Grand Vizier, who was an old and trusted chum, he made her turn her pocket inside out, and there at the bottom was a gaping hole. "Your jewels are scattered all over the forest, my dear," said the Grand Vizier. "Oh, lummy," said the Princess Thingamajig, "whatever is Papa going to say?" And the Grand Vizier, who had a pretty shrewd idea of what Papa was going to say and didn't want to be around when he said it, replied tactfully, "I think perhaps it would be better to break it to Her Majesty first." So they went along to the Queen, who was occupied in knitting a long mauve scarf, and just at that moment was in the middle of counting her stitches. "Ahem," said the Grand Vizier. "I'm afraid, Your Majesty, that the Princess Thingamajig has mislaid her christening present." "Oh, bother," said the Queen. "You've made me lose count. What was that you were saying?" "I said Princess Thingamajig has lost her marbles," said the Grand Vizier a bit tetchily. "Must be taking after her father," snapped the Queen. "He lost his years ago." No, Your Majesty, I meant her jewelled marbles." "Oh, those," said the Queen dismissively. Queen Matilda was on the folksy side. She tended to wear hand-woven skirts and long dangling strings of beads, and she prided herself on not being interested in money. It is, of course, as one of the courtiers rather snidely observed, a good deal easier not to be interested in money when you've already got the stuff coming out of your ears. "Well, you'd better tell the king." "I think," said the Grand Vizier, who wasn't keen on getting hung, drawn and quartered, "that it would be better coming from Your Majesty." "Oh, very well," said the Queen, and she rolled up her mauve scarf and strode into the king's chamber. The Grand Vizier and Princess Thingamajig stood outside with their fingers stuck in their ears, awaiting the blast which they knew would be forthcoming when the king received the news. When they saw the door bulge outwards and the handle drop off, they knew he'd been told. Inside the royal chamber, the Queen was trying to pour oil over a troubled king. "Listen," she was saying, "you know you'd like to get Thingamajig married off." She was on a good tack here, because Thingamajig's tuneless humming was beginning, as King Fredobert inelegantly put it, to get on his wick. "Well then," went on Matilda, "if you're so keen to get the marbles back, why don't you offer a reward to the finder? Half your kingdom and the hand of your daughter." "Don't talk daft, woman," roared the king. "The hand of my daughter, by all means, half my kingdom, not on your Nelly." And so it was arranged, and the proclamation went forth, and princes from far and wide came riding to the court of King Fredobert, attracted by the picture of Thingamajig on the posters, and spurred on by their fathers, who had an eye on Fredobert's cash flow. The quest was open only to princes, because, as the king said, "We don't want her marrying any old who's-it, what's-it, or so-and-so," by which, of course, he meant Tom, Dick, or Harry. It had been decided that whoever collected the most marbles would claim the prize, and all the princes gathered in the courtyard, while the Grand Vizier read out the rules to them and explained that, as in all the best competitions, the editor's, or in this case King Fredobert's, decision would be final. From her room overlooking the courtyard, the Princess Thingamajig was rather anxiously giving the once-over to all her potential bridegrooms, and deciding that they were a pretty moth-eaten lot. There was Prince Alexander of Antipasto, who she was sure would get up to all sorts of dirty tricks in order to try to win. Not for nothing was he known as Smart Alec to his friends. Then there was Prince Archibald the Arrogant, who didn't have the brains to think up any dirty tricks, but was so arrogant that he would stop at nothing rather than be beaten. And there was Prince Sidney of Simpletonia, Simple Sid to his mates, who was a nice enough fellow, but happened to be slightly soft in the head, and many, many more. Thingamajig gazed at them gloomily, and decided that the only thing in their favour was that, being the eldest sons of the neighbouring kings, they were all in line to inherit frightfully wealthy kingdoms. She sighed. Even all that money seemed a high price to pay for marrying one of that lot. Then suddenly, in the corner of the courtyard, she glimpsed a figure that made her heart jump about a bit, because she recognised him from her childhood days, when he used to come to palace parties and boss her about. But he also showed her his pet tadpoles and let her play with his collection of conkers. He was different from the others in that he was not an eldest. In fact, he was the youngest son of a very impoverished king and stood to inherit nothing. He was, in short, poor but honest, or reasonably so. He was also extremely handsome, and he had a twinkle in his eye. He was Prince William of Apple, commonly known as Bill. Princess Thingamajig was shot from her reverie by the firing of the platinum-plated pistol which marked the start of the quest, and all the princes went rampaging out into the forest, bounding into the bushes, grovelling in the grass, and leaping through the leaves. All except Prince Sidney of Simpletonia, who had recently read the story of the thieving magpie, and so spent his time climbing trees to see if a magpie had picked up the marbles and hidden them in its nest. As we've said before, he was a bit soft in the head. Naturally, since the forest was large, and the Princess Thingamajig had walked a long way, and there were 33 marbles in all, the quest continued over days and weeks, and began to stretch into months, and the wildlife of the forest was getting frightfully fed up, disturbed as it was by all those trampling princes who every so often gave great wild yells when they actually found a marble. There was one particularly noisy moment when Prince Sidney's balmy magpie theory actually paid off, and he fell out of a tree, clutching an emerald marble, and landed with a thump on top of Prince Archibald. Then they both yelled. The wildlife began to yearn for the days when the only thing that disturbed it was Princess Thingamajig's tuneless humming. Each time a prince found a marble, he went galloping back to the palace, and the Grand Vizier would chalk it up on the blackboard and drop the marble into a box bearing the name of the prince who'd found it. At one point, Smart Alec of Antipasto caused a sensation by strolling into the courtyard with a smirk on his face. "If he gets much sharper, he'll cut himself," murmured the Grand Vizier without much originality, nonchalantly carrying an amethyst, a ruby, and a turquoise, having nipped quickly back to his own kingdom and rifled his mother's jewel box. Unfortunately for him, in his absence, those particular marbles had already been found by other searchers who, because of the aforementioned tendency to yell at the moment of discovery, had plenty of other princes as witnesses. It gave the Grand Vizier enormous pleasure to box Prince Alec's ears and send him home with a flea in them. "And don't give my regards to your family," King Fredobert called after him as he went sulking home. Gradually, one by one, the marbles were gathered in. Some princes found none, some one, some two, But the princes who searched the hardest were Prince Archibald the Arrogant, because he could never bear to be beaten, and Prince Bill of Apple, because he'd caught a glimpse of the Princess Thingamajig at her window, and remembered how, when they were children, she had actually enjoyed seeing his collection of tadpoles, instead of turning away in disgust, as other little girls had done. She would, he thought, make rather a jolly bride. So the moment came when there was only the sapphire marble left to find, and Prince Archibald and Prince Bill were neck and neck, with 6 marbles each to their credit, and Bill, who you'll remember, although honest, was only reasonably so, and who by now wanted very badly to marry Thingamajig, had a brilliant idea. He whipped off to the family jack-of-all-trades and had him make a sapphire blue glass marble of exactly the right dimensions, and dashing back into the forest, he plunged into a clearing, let out a whoop, and held the false marble aloft in triumph. All the other princes came clustering round to congratulate him, except for Archibald, who stood a bit aside with a nasty sort of sneer on his face. "Funny," he said. "I've just looked over there." "Not hard enough, old man, not hard enough," yelled Bill, and bounded off towards the palace to get the sapphire chalked up by the Grand Vizier. The Grand Vizier was delighted to find that he was the winner, and King Fredobert, who didn't particularly mind who had won but was just thankful to get the marbles back, made all haste to proclaim the winner and the wedding banns. "But not so fast," said Prince Archibald. "Hadn't you better check that all the marbles are genuine? You don't want perhaps to get fobbed off with some glass baubles or other imitations, do you?" And he slid a sidelong look at Prince Bill, who, being reasonably honest, blushed to the roots of his hair. King Fredobert, who certainly didn't want to get fobbed off with glass baubles or other imitations, said, "By Jove, that's true. We'd better test 'em. I will shoot at each of them with the diamond marble, and if they don't split or splinter, then we'll know they're the genuine job. Grand Vizier, line 'em up." The Princess Thingamajig, who'd been keeping a pretty close eye on both Prince Archibald and Bill, noticed the smugly sneering look of Archibald and the flushed and flustered look of Bill, and she sidled over to the latter and reached out and squeezed his hand, at which he looked even more flushed and flustered. The Grand Vizier emptied the marbles from their boxes, lined them up, and then asked Prince Bill for the final sapphire, which he placed on the end of the line. King Fredobert rolled up his sleeves, spat on his hands, and bent down for the first shot. He fancied himself as a bit of a dab hand at marbles. In fact, the only reason he'd given them to Thingamajig in the first place was so that he could play with them himself. One by one he picked off the emerald, the agate, the aquamarine, and so on down the line, and each stone remained sound. But Prince Archibald still stood with a smirk on his face. Then finally Fredobert took aim at the last marble. The diamond shot across the courtyard, crashed into the sapphire, propelled it at lightning speed against the courtyard wall, and lo! It too remained perfectly round, glittering and crackless. The smirk was wiped from Archibald's face as if by a windscreen wiper. But Bill was no longer looking flushed and flustered, and as for Princess Thingamajig, she looked like a cat who had swallowed not only the cream, but a couple of prize goldfish as well. But, stammered Archibald, "I'm sure it's a fake. I'll bet it's glass." "Nonsense, my boy," said Fredobert. "As fine a sapphire as ever was seen." And he brushed past him, walked over to Bill, and placed Thingamajig's hand in his. "There you are," he said. "She's all yours, and I hope you can teach her to hum something with a bit of tune in it." And it was the Princess Thingamajig's turn to smirk, as she reflected on how, at the moment she heard that Bill had found the sapphire, she'd suddenly remembered that on the day she'd lost her marbles, she hadn't taken that one with her. She'd been using it to stop her bottle of ginger pop. Therefore she knew that Bill must have perpetrated a bit of a fiddle somewhere, and clutching the sapphire in her hand, she had rushed into the courtyard to see how things worked out. When Archibald started chucking spanners in the works by demanding tests, she knew that disaster was about to strike. Although she was rich, she was also honest, but like Bill, only within reason, So she had sidled up to the flushed and flustered prince, clutching his hand, and neatly slipped the sapphire into his palm. And now she thought, all that remains is to live happily ever after. Then another idea struck her. King Fredibert was in the middle of proclaiming her forthcoming marriage, and she stepped forward to interrupt him. "But, Papa, dear," she said, "surely you haven't forgotten the rest of the reward?" "No, of course I haven't forgotten," blustered the king, who, as we know, would never admit to being the least bit forgetful. The Princess Thingamajig bathed him in a blinding smile and said, "I was sure you'd remember that you'd promised half your kingdom." King Fredibert's jaw dropped halfway to his knees. He remembered no such thing, but his pride in his memory was such that not even for half his kingdom was he going to admit it. He did a hasty bit of reflection. "Oh, well," he thought, "the kingdom is getting a bit much to manage, and what's-her-name is married to a prince who's practically got running hot and cold money in every room, and whatchamacallit is on the brink of marrying one who is equally stacked with the stuff, and Matilda is always banging on about how she doesn't care for cash. So since Thingamajig is only marrying a prince who is poor but honest, or reasonably so, she'll need a bit extra. And he, poor blighter, needs some reward if he's going to put up with all that tuneless humming." And so it all fell neatly into place. 3 princesses and their princes lived happily ever after. Queen Matilda went back to knitting her long mauve scarf, and as for King Fredobert, he just forgot the whole thing.
The Prince Who Had a Problem of Speech. Read by Dennis Waterman.
Once upon a time there was a prince who had a speech problem. Well, to be accurate, he had 2 problems. One was that he stammered, and the other one was that he could not pronounce his R's, which made it doubly unfortunate that his parents had seen fit to christen him Reginald Robert Richard, and that he came from the country of Roxania. To add to his problems, he was not a particularly beautiful young man. Well, to be fair to him as possible, he was not exactly ugly, but he could have doubled for one of the Flintstones, and no questions asked. And he had the mentality to match. So when the time came for him to think about courting suitable local princesses, his parents were aware that they had a problem on their hands, and they decided to have a parents-to-prince talk with him about it. Wedge, they called. It had always seemed to them simpler to call him Wedge because, well, that is what he called himself, except when he called himself Wedge. "Wedge, we need to have a little talk to you." "What about?" queried Reginald, who was perfectly happy whittling away at a stick and didn't want to be disturbed. "About your future," said the king. "The thing is, if you're going to have a future, you're going to have to speak a bit better." Reginald was astounded. "Why?" he spluttered indignantly. "What's wrong with the way I speak?" "Not a lot, dear," said the Queen soothingly. "Not a lot. Nothing that a trained therapist can't sort out, I'm sure." "What's a trained therapist?" asked Reg anxiously. "You'll see, dear," said the Queen, and set about finding one. But it seemed she had been over-optimistic. Highly qualified speech therapists came rushing from all over Rexania to try to cure the prince of his problems. But they all soon discovered it was like trying to teach a brick wall to jump. The problem was that Reg simply did not know that he had a problem. "I've always spoken all white," he insisted, "so that was that." The King and Queen decided they would have to turn to alternative medicine, and to this end they decided to issue a proclamation promising a handsome reward for anyone who could cure the prince of his stammer. "But I'm not having any of that rubbish about giving away half my kingdom," said the King firmly. "Anyone can have Wedge's hand who wants it, and good riddance," he added with a distinct lack of paternal feeling. "But the kingdom stays mine, and that's that." "Very well, dear," said the Queen. "We'll offer a couple of sacks of gold. That should do the trick." It did indeed. From the four corners of the kingdom, all sorts of conditions of would-be physicians came cantering into the capital to try their luck, until the courtyard was crowded to overflowing with acupuncturists, aromatherapists, astrologers, beauticians, chiropodists, chiropractors, clairvoyants, conjurers, dietitians, faith healers, genealogists, homeopaths, hypnotherapists, karate experts, magicians, manicurists, marriage guidance counsellors, masseurs, mothers' helps, naturopaths, osteopaths, palmists, psychiatrists, psychologists, physiotherapists, radiotherapists, religious maniacs, Scientologists, stress managers, trampolinists, trichologists, vegetarians, ventriloquists, and a whole lot of other ists that nobody had ever heard of before. Reginald just gazed at them all in amazement and went on with his whittling. Throughout the following days and weeks, all sorts of curious cures were tried out on Reginald. Aromatherapists rubbed him with essential oils, acupuncturists stuck him with needles in peculiar places, chiropractors cracked his joints, psychiatrists told him he was in love with his rocking horse, and hypnotherapists instructed him to stare into space for hours on end and think of nothing. Reginald found this quite easy to do. People without any special skills conjured up any number of supposedly foolproof remedies. One expected him to speak with marbles in his mouth, and it was not until he had swallowed 3 of them that he abandoned the project. Another tried to make him hang by his ankles, upside down from the branch of a tree, and the only result of that experiment was that the marbles came back. But the stuttering certainly did not stop. On and on went the rota of ridiculous remedies, until Reginald finally flew into a rage and vowed he would not try another one. Just at that very moment, a very pedantic, skinny, middle-aged lady stepped out of the crowd and announced in a high-pitched and terribly refined voice, "I used to be a governess to a little boy who stammered, and I finally found that she lost the affliction if she spoke in rhyme." Everyone present was somewhat puzzled by the pronouncement, none of them ever having heard of rhyme, until it was suddenly borne in upon them that due to the refinement of the governess's accent, what she was actually referring to was poetry. "Well, it's worth giving it a whirl," said the king. "Go on, Wedge, give us a verse." Reginald, who had not greatly enjoyed being hung upside down by his heels, but who had finally been made to see that perhaps he did have a bit of a problem, now realised it would be wise to cooperate with this relatively pain-free remedy. So he thought very deeply, which was difficult for him, and finally burst out with, "Stammer, stammer, go away." And then there was a long pause whilst the king, the queen, and all the courtiers stood in breathless silence, waiting till his face flushed with triumph. Reginald finished with a flourish. It's gone, hip hip, hooray!" And the whole courtyard burst into a perfect pandemonium of applause. Reginald was fairly bursting with pride. "If poetry my stammers stopped," he declared, "a rhyming speech I'll now adopt." The Queen, who was of a literary disposition, winced. "He's not exactly a second Shakespeare, is he?" she murmured, and the King added, "Nor even a third, fourth or fifth." But Reginald had really got the bit between his teeth now, and nothing on earth would stop him prancing around the palace in an elephantine way, giving up with the most excruciating rhyming couplets. "Mamma, I'd like a cup of tea. Because it's 4 o'clock, you see," he chirruped cheerfully. It was actually 2:30, but his poetic muse was not up to coping with something so complicated. "I'd also like to eat a bun. My goodness, aren't I having fun?" he went on. If it were true that he was having fun, then he was the only one that was. Throughout the rest of the day he spewed forth jingles non-stop until the whole court was heartily sick of him. Moreover, his newfound sense of power seemed to make him considerably more aggressive and arrogant than he had ever been before, and the astounded staff tended to get orders like, "Come and shine my boots, you Burke. It's time you did a bit of work," from someone who had previously sidled up shyly and said, I wonder if you would be so frightfully kind and give my boots a bit of a rub up, and when you've got the time. And to the royal chef, to whom he had been wont to whisper winningly, I say, this rice pudding's absolutely whipping, he now thundered. This is rotten currant bread. You should go and boil your head. There was a good deal of muttering amongst the minions, and a long queue of courtiers, cooks and castle cleaners formed up in front of the Queen, waiting to hand in their notices. Better a stammering, whittling wedge, they thought, than this lyrical lout who spewed out odious odes without end. The governess who had suggested the cure stood by a little nervously. "Ahem," she said. "Ahem, your Majesty. Perhaps I may be permitted to remind you of the little matter of the sacks of gold." "Oh, crikey," said the king, who had forgotten all about the reward. "Hang on a minute, I'll go and fetch them." And he ambled off to look for the 2 smallest sacks he could find. He thought it was a bit hard, actually, to have to pay to be landed with Wedge in his present state, but a promise is a promise, so he dutifully filled the sacks with ducats and handed them over to the governess, who grabbed them with the speed of lightning that has been twice greased, and was over the hill and far away and beyond the blue horizon with her booty before Reginald could utter another single syllable. Now, whilst the King and Queen and the whole castle staff might consider Reginald's cure to be something of a blight on their own lives, the populations of all the neighbouring countries considered it a cause for congratulations. They had, of course, all known of the prince's problem, and rejoiced for Rexania that it had been resolved, and the kings and queens and princes and princesses from all the nearby lands came flocking to offer their felicitations. The very first to arrive were the king and queen of the next-door kingdom of Floribunda with their daughter, the Princess Rose. Now, by a strange coincidence, which was the sort of thing that happened once upon a time, Rose had the same problem of pronouncing her R's as Reginald. So she always referred to herself as Princess Rose. We shall never know whether it was a fellow feeling or not, but the moment she clapped eyes on Reginald, it was love at first sight for both of them. Princess Rose didn't seem to mind that Reginald looked like a Flintstone, which may have been because she herself was a dead ringer for a female Flintstone. Neither of them said a word, which was just as well in Reginald's case. They just gazed into each other's eyes in mutual admiration. While the prince and princess stood staring at each other like a couple of dumbstruck cows, the king and queen of Roxania were explaining to the king and queen of Floribunda that Reginald's cure was not quite the blessing it at first appeared to be, and they explained about the rhyming couplets. "Tell you what," said the king of Floribunda, "we've brought the court magician along. It's really his weekend off, but wanted to come with us and congratulate you. He can sometimes be quite a dab hand at this sort of thing. Would you like him to have a go?" "Would we?" chorused the king and queen in unison. So the Floribundan court magician was brought before them, and after a certain amount of bowing and scraping, he said, "Whilst I am unable to cure His Highness's stammer, I could cast a spell which would transfer it to some other creature in the land. If that would give satisfaction, sire," he added, in the deferential manner of the perfect gentleman's gentleman. "You betcha," said the king eagerly. "Get casting, quickly, man. Let's not lose another moment." So the magician whisked his wand about a bit, intoned something that sounded like hoodly-boodly boshamboo, and then turned to the king with a satisfied smirk. "All done, your majesty," he intoned. One almost expected him to add, "You can rinse out now." But at this moment a diversion was called by Reginald suddenly giving tongue. "Rose," he breathed adoringly. "Wedge," she responded similarly. "Oh, Rose. Oh, Wedge. Oh, Rose. Oh, Wedge." The king and queen of Roxania tentatively looked at each other in wonderment. So far, not a single stammer or a rhyming couplet could be heard in all the land. "I trust everything is to your satisfaction, sire," murmured the magician with his palm discreetly held out. The king dutifully crossed it with gold and congratulated him. "Capital job," he said. "Complete cure!" And the magician unctuously bowed out backwards. But no sooner had the king stopped speaking than he heard Reginald say, "Oh, Rose, I think you are divine. Please promise to be mine." "Shut up," said the king, thumping him. "You don't have to speak in rhyme anymore. Your stammer has gone." "But I like speaking in rhyme," said Reginald, whereupon the king thumped him so hard that he stopped speaking altogether, and remembering the thump, which really was exceptionally hard, he never ever spoke in verse again. Meanwhile, deep down in the depths of the dim, dark, distant forest, a baby snake was born. Of course, once upon a time, almost all animals could talk, in their own particular way, and the baby snake, on opening his eyes, also opened his mouth to say, "So where am I?" But the "so" came out, "Sir." The mother snake was startled for a second, but because she kept her ear to the ground and was abreast of all that was going on in the kingdom, she realised exactly what had happened. The Floribundian magician's spell had transferred Reginald's stutter to her offspring. She hastened to soothe her son. "That's a very nice noise, dear," she said. "Better a stammering snake than a versifying viper," she thought grimly. And from that time forth, all the snake's descendants have consistently stuttered. So if you have ever wondered, which you probably haven't, why snakes always seem to hiss, now at least you know the reason.
Jimmy and the Apple Tree, read by Martin Jarvis.
Jimmy was on the topmost branch of the apple tree when he heard his mother calling, "Jimmy, time to come in and wash your hands for supper." Jimmy didn't want to go in. He didn't even particularly want any supper. He was in the middle of his 5th apple and would have been quite happy to continue eating them. But he knew his mother and he knew her rules, so reluctantly he slid down the branches and landed with a thump at the base of the tree. He sat there for a few moments, rubbing his back against the bark, and wishing there didn't have to be rules and timetables in life, and that he didn't always have to do as he was told. Aloud he said, "I wish I was something other than a boy."
"I wish I were,"
said a voice.
"Tut, tut, what deplorable grammar."
Startled, Jimmy looked around, but saw no one. "Who said that?" he asked. The voice came again. It was not quite a human voice, more like the rustling of a breeze through leaves. It said,
"It was I who spoke. I am the apple tree."
Jimmy's jaw dropped open in disbelief.
"Oh, yes,"
went on the strange voice.
"When you were scrambling about in my branches and stripping me of my fruit, you are unaware of the exceptional qualities I possess."
"What exceptional qualities?" asked Jimmy. "Apart from being able to talk, of course. Most trees can't."
"How do you know?"
retorted the apple tree. Jimmy was silent. He'd just always assumed that trees couldn't talk. He went back on the attack. "What exceptional qualities?" he repeated.
"To anyone who rubs their back against my bark, as you have just done, I can grant wishes. Anyone who has tasted my apples will know that my bark is better than my bite,"
said the tree, and rustled a hearty laugh.
"That's a joke,"
it added. "Not a very good one," said Jimmy.
"Watch it,"
retorted the apple tree.
"If you don't mind your manners, I won't grant your wish. What was it, by the way?"
Jimmy couldn't make out whether he was dreaming or not, but he decided to play along, in case it was all true. "I'm fed up with being a boy," he said. "I'd rather be something that didn't have rules and regular meal times and have to do as they were told."
"Such as?"
asked the tree. Jimmy considered. He thought of his dog, Trigger, who bounded about after balls, who never came when he was called, and who ate his meals when he felt like it. "I wish I was—" he began.
"Were,"
said the tree emphatically. "Oh, all right, have it your own way," said Jimmy. "I wish I were a dog."
"Are you quite sure?"
asked the tree. Jimmy considered again. "Well, suppose I don't like being a dog?" he asked cautiously.
"You'll have 2 chances to turn into something else, but the 3rd change is the last and will be forever, or at any rate until you can come back to me and renew the magic."
Jimmy thought. That sounds fair," he said. "How do I do it?"
"Just rub your back against my bark as before and say, 'Apple tree, listen to me,' and then you make your wish."
"OK," replied Jimmy, and started rubbing his shoulders against the trunk of the tree as he chanted, apple tree, listen to me. I wish I were," he brought out triumphantly, "a dog." And he looked down and found his body covered with a long shaggy coat. He tried to say, "It works," but only a strangled sort of growl came out. Then he tried to stand up. It was a very curious sensation being on 4 legs and having to hold his head up to see. He spied a ball in the middle of the lawn and went bounding towards it, trying to pick it up in his mouth as he passed. He'd seen Trigger do this hundreds of times, and it had looked dead easy. It wasn't at all easy when he tried to do it, and all 4 of his legs went splattering in different directions as he skidded past the ball. Then he heard a ferocious growl directly behind him, and he turned to face Trigger, who was baring his teeth and snarling at him. He realised he was trespassing on Trigger's territory. "It's all right, Trigger," he said. "It's only me, Jimmy." But it came out as, "Woof, woof, 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 woof." Trigger just growled again. Jimmy realised it would be difficult for Trigger to recognise this 4-legged hairy creature as his 2-legged smooth-skinned master. He tried wagging his tail to show that he was friendly, but only fell over sideways in the attempt. Trigger was bearing down upon him with the look of a dog who's going to take another dog by the scruff of its neck and shake it till its liver came loose. Jimmy decided flight was the only course, and remembered the hole in the hedge behind the gooseberry bush, which led into Mr. Angmering's garden next door. And as Trigger suddenly made a great leap forward, he turned and made for it as fast as his 4 uncoordinated legs would carry him. He just managed to squeeze through as Trigger's jaws snapped together on the last hairs in his tail. Once through, he lay on Mr. Angmering's lawn with his tongue hanging out, panting like a steam engine. Trigger didn't follow him through. He'd defended his territory, and that was all he cared about. When he was a bit calmer, Jimmy cautiously got up and began to explore Mr. Angmering's garden, keeping a wary eye open for its owner, for Mr. Angmering, he knew, didn't like dogs. Well, he didn't like Trigger anyway, and Jimmy was beginning to see his point. Mr. Angmering was a writer who insisted that he needed peace and quiet to work, and when Trigger was barking and bounding about next door, he didn't get a lot of peace. Suddenly the back door of Mr. Angmering's house opened, and a woman came out and began hanging out washing on the clothesline. Jimmy jumped into a bush and stayed there till her back turned, and then he shot inside the open back door. He'd always wanted to see what the inside of Mr. Angmering's house was like. Nobody knew because he never invited anybody. He found himself in the kitchen. He looked round. On the kitchen table was the supper which he supposed the woman in the garden was preparing for Mr. Angmering. There was a big bowl of salad, a dish of new potatoes, and a plate with a cold chicken leg on it. Jimmy loved cold chicken, and all of a sudden he felt decidedly peckish. But 5 apples seemed a long way away now. He'd seen Trigger jump onto a chair and then onto a table, and he wondered if he could do it. He hunched his back legs up tight, kept his eye on the chicken, and gave a great spring upwards. It was like flying. All of a sudden, there he was on the table, drooling at the mouth beside the leg of chicken. He grabbed it up in his jaws at exactly the same moment as Mr. Angmering opened the kitchen door and caught sight of him. They both froze for a couple of seconds. Then Jimmy tried a friendly wag of his tail. It was more successful than his first effort, but he could see Mr. Angmering was not impressed. Then Jimmy and Mr. Angmering both went into action at the same time. Mr. Angmering lurched forward, shouting, "Come here, you miserable cur, and I'll break every bone in your body." And Jimmy leapt down from the table, the chicken leg still in his mouth, and sped towards the back door. He dashed out, hotly pursued by Mr. Angmering, who collided in the doorway with the woman who was coming in from hanging out the washing. This held him up for a bit, so Jimmy was able to get away with a flying start. He was hindered by the chicken in his mouth, but he wasn't going to give it up now when he'd gone through such peril to get it. Mr. Angmering disentangled himself from the woman and set off towards the bottom of the garden, where Jimmy had just squeezed through the gate which led to the field beyond. "Now I know what they mean by a dog's life," he thought, as he heard Mr. Angmering click through the gate and come panting after him, gaining with every stride. A stream ran across the middle of the field, and Jimmy reached it a few paces ahead of Mr. Angmering. Jimmy had won a medal for the butterfly stroke at the school sports, so he plunged fearlessly into the water and began to do the butterfly stroke with all his might. All that happened was that he swallowed a great deal of water and started to sink to the bottom. Dogs can't do the butterfly, he suddenly realised. Dogs can only paddle. And at that very moment he felt Mr. Angmering grasp him by the tail. He began to paddle for dear life, but the harder he paddled, the harder Mr. Angmering pulled, and Mr. Angmering was winning. Crumbling crocodiles, thought Jimmy. I don't like being a dog. It's about time I was something else. He thought quickly and barked aloud, "I wish I were a fish." All that happened was a harder tug on his tail from Mr. Angmering. "Oh, something's gone wrong," thought Jimmy wildly. "Jumping Jehoshaphat, what was that rhyme? Maybe I ought to say that." He took a great breath and barked, apple tree, listen to me. I wish I were a fish." And all at once he plunged directly into the depths of the stream as Mr. Angmering's hand slid from his slippery tail fin. Jimmy was delighted to see that this caused him to lose his balance, so that he too descended with an almighty splash into the stream, sank to the bottom, and rose up spluttering and blowing bubbles, then scrambled out onto the bank, roundly cursing all dogs. "I'm a fish," thought Jimmy. "I really am a fish." And once more he tried to strike out with the butterfly stroke, and once more it didn't work. He hadn't got any arms and legs, and he just went spiralling to the bottom. "Well," he thought, "at least fish can breathe underwater, but I wish I could stop rolling over and over. What have I got instead of arms and legs? Fins, of course." Experimentally, he stretched out his fins, and all of a sudden he was on an even keel. He gave a flip with his right fin, and immediately rolled over again. Better try both fins at once, he decided. And as he did so, he shot swiftly forward through the shimmering water. He did it again and again, and went speeding past colonies of tiny little fish who were lazily swimming around. "Oh, this is wonderful," he said out loud. All that came out was a series of different-sized bubbles, but a lot of fish turned and looked at him, so he decided they'd heard in fish language. "But I can't go forwards forever," he thought. "I wonder how I can turn a corner." Just then, a larger fish swam across his path, gave a great flick of its tail, and turned at right angles. "Of course, my tail is my rudder," thought Jimmy, and gave it an experimental flick, and found, to his delight, that it sent him round in a delicious curve. "Wow, I'm swimming like a fish," he exulted. "Well, of course, I am a fish." And he began weaving, ducking and diving, and revelled in the sensation of slipping so easily through the cool, clear water. He hadn't realised what it would be like having so many directions to move in. Not only could he go backwards and forwards, but he could go sideways and upwards and downwards as well. "Phew," he gasped. "This beats walking on flat earth any time." And he floated lazily along, pretty exhausted after all the exercise he'd taken. He realized, too, that he'd worked up quite a hearty appetite. After all, he reflected, the apples were ages ago. I haven't had my own supper, and I hardly got a bite off that chicken leg. And he started looking round for something to eat. Looking round as a fish was much easier than looking round as a boy, because now he had an eye on each side of his head, so that he could see almost all around him with one glance. Suddenly, a few yards in front of him, he spied a worm, and his fishy heart leapt for joy. As a boy, a worm wouldn't have appealed to him at all, but as a fish, it seemed to be just what the doctor ordered. He swam eagerly towards it, and the worm obligingly stayed floating in the same place. Jimmy got up to it, opened his mouth, and had just started to swallow it when there was a sharp pain in his upper lip, and he felt himself being dragged upward through the water, and then flying through the air, and finally landing with a thump on the bank of the stream. "Oh, panting pelicans, I've been caught," he thought, and he hastily started gabbling, apple tree, listen to me!" But neither sound nor bubbles came out of his mouth, and in a panic he realized that fish could only talk under water. "Oh, suffering snakes," he thought, "now I'm for it." A huge hand hovered over him as he lay gasping on the bank, and then it picked him up, and another hand removed the hook from his mouth. He heard a man's voice say, "This one's no good, it's only a tiddler, I'll chuck it back." And all of a sudden Jimmy found himself hurtling through the air in a great arc, and finally landing with a splash back into the stream. He lay for some time on the bottom, too shattered by his experience to move. He started thinking things over. He'd enjoyed being a fish, but obviously there were dangers which he hadn't thought about before. However, now that he knew about the hazards of floating worms, all he had to do was to avoid them and look for his food elsewhere. After he'd got his breath and his confidence back, he started slowly to swim around again. The sun was now shining very brightly, and its rays were quite dazzling through the shimmering water. Jimmy felt he could do with a bit of shade, so seeing some rushes growing by the bank, he made his way towards them. As he swam into them, the shade was deliciously cool, and he felt completely relaxed. He floated contentedly for a few moments, but then he noticed that the rushes in front of him were beginning to sway and bend, as though they were being pushed by some unseen force. Suddenly they parted, and Jimmy found himself gazing straight into the eyes of the most enormous pike he'd ever seen. Terror froze him to the spot, but then slowly the pike opened its mouth. It opened it wider and wider and wider as it advanced towards Jimmy. There was no doubt whatsoever about its intentions. "Cantering kippers," thought Jimmy. "This is it." And his brain began to race madly, trying to think of something else into which he could turn himself. He wanted something calm, which led an unexciting life and wasn't chased by dogs or hooked by fishermen. His mind went back to the beginning of his adventures, when he'd escaped from Trigger through the hole in the hedge behind the gooseberry bush. The pike's jaws were opening even wider, and then, just as they began to snap shut, Jimmy hastily burbled, apple tree, listen to me. I wish I were a gooseberry bush." And all of a sudden, there he was, standing in the soil of his own sunny garden, with luscious fruit sprouting out all over him. Insofar as a gooseberry bush can heave a sigh of relief, Jimmy the gooseberry bush heaved one then. "Cackling catfish," he gasped. "Oh, that was a narrow squeak." When he had calmed down a bit, he began to enjoy his new situation. It was lovely, just standing quietly in the sun, not being menaced by dogs or men or enormous fish. He spread his branches upwards to the sky and rested peacefully. After a little while, he saw the kitchen door open, and his mother came out of it with a basket over her arm. She made directly towards him, and when she stood in front of him, she started plucking the gooseberries from his branches. "Oh, hey, Mum, don't do that," he winced. "That hurts." He hadn't got a real voice, but like the apple tree, he found he could talk by rustling his leaves. Unfortunately, it seemed to be the kind of talk his mother couldn't hear, because she went on placidly picking his fruit. "Mum, pack it in, can't you?" groaned Jimmy. "It's me, Jimmy, and you're hurting me." Somewhat naturally, his mother didn't recognise her son as a gooseberry bush. Pluck, 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 she went, until her basket was full to the brim. Then she turned and went back into the kitchen, leaving Jimmy exhausted and sore in every branch. Who would have thought that even a gooseberry bush would suffer like that? He thought bitterly. But then he brightened, because all his fruit was now gone, so the process wouldn't be repeated in a hurry. He settled down to enjoy his calm existence again. Just then, his 2 older brothers home from school came into the garden with their football and began kicking it about. Jimmy watched contentedly for a while, and then his brother Jack took a terrific rush at the ball and sent it shooting at breakneck speed straight at the gooseberry bush. Jimmy tried for all he was worth to run out of its way, but realised for the very first time what it was like to be literally rooted to the spot. Then he tried to sway from side to side in order to dodge the oncoming ball, but finally he just had to watch helplessly as it hurtled towards him, then hit him amidships with tremendous force, knocking all the breath out of him and scattering his leaves all over the place. He thought of the number of times that he himself had shot a football into the bushes without thinking what pain it might be causing some innocent plant. He had to suffer 5 more blows to his branches before his brothers packed up and went indoors. Jimmy heaved another sigh of relief, but the final insult was yet to come. He saw Trigger advancing towards him across the lawn. When he arrived at the base of the gooseberry bush, Trigger turned around and raised his back leg. Slowly, Jimmy became aware of a trickle of warm liquid soaking into the soil all over his rooted feet. This was too much. He decided that life as a gooseberry bush wasn't at all what he'd imagined it to be. He would jolly well prefer to be something else. But what? This time he had to be very, very careful, because hadn't the apple tree warned him that the next wish would be the last? "Think, Jimmy, think," he told himself. Just then he heard his mother calling him again. "Jimmy, haven't you come in to wash yet? You better hurry up. It's spaghetti bolognese for supper." Spaghetti bolognese. Jimmy realised again how hungry he was, and he adored spaghetti bolognese. He reflected that dogs didn't get spaghetti bolognese for supper, neither did fish nor gooseberry bushes. There were certain compensations for being a boy, after all. In fact, when he came to think of it, a boy's life was better than any of the ones he'd tried that afternoon. He took a deep breath. Apple tree, listen to me," he rustled. "I wish I were a boy." He hardly dared to look down, but when he did, he found to his joy that his roots had gone, and he once more had 2 legs encased in shorts. "Bouncing buffaloes!" he yelled. "I'm a boy again! Whoopee!" Once again his mother's voice called from the kitchen. "Coming, Mum," he answered, and made his way towards the house. On his way he passed the apple tree, and the breeze that wafted through its branches gave the impression that it was waving to him. Its leaves rustled, and Jimmy could have sworn he heard it say,
"Come and try my magic again another day."
"If I do," muttered Jimmy, "I'll jolly well make sure I choose to be something that's more powerful than anything else in the world. I'll be a lion or a tiger or an elephant. I'll bet they're never beaten and battered and chased like I've been today." Then he thought of the spaghetti bolognese, and with a cheery wave of his hand to the apple tree, he went bounding into the house to enjoy his supper. "Don't forget to wash your hands before you come to the table," his mother called. Jimmy sighed, shrugged his shoulders, and then grinned ruefully, and did as he was told.
Morning Glory Road, read by Sandra Dickenson.
Lisa Liza Bruce's Aunt Edwina made the best rock buns in the world, and rock buns were Liza's favourite food. Whenever she went to stay with Aunt Edwina, the smell of baking rock buns would always waft towards her, before she even got to the garden gate. However, there came an occasion when this didn't happen. It seemed that Aunt Edwina had been too busy cutting sandwiches for the vicarage tea party to do her weekly baking. But as she bent to kiss Liza, she said reassuringly, "You run and play in the garden while I knock up a nice batch of rock buns." So Liza ran out into the flower-filled garden. She loved all the flowers, but her favourites were the sky-blue morning glories, which clambered all over the front porch. She bent over to smell one, but it seemed to have no scent. Then she sniffed really hard, until the pollen of the flower rose in a great yellow cloud around her nose. As the golden dust tickled up her nostrils, Liza became aware of the strangest sensation. It seemed as if the trumpet of the morning glory was getting larger and larger. The harder she sniffed, the bigger became the trumpet, until it became so enormous that it was like the entrance to a bright blue cave. Liza hesitated for a moment, and then stepped firmly inside, and walked purposely along the huge tunnel which led, she knew not where. Within seconds, a radiant light appeared at the end of the tunnel, and its blue walls seemed to melt away and become part of the brightest of blue skies. She walked out into a lovely country landscape onto a wide road leading straight ahead. A little way along the road was a huge archway made of every imaginable flower, and across the top was a banner made of morning glories which read, "You are now entering Garlandia." At the foot of the arch was a notice saying, "Garlandia welcomes careful singers." And beside the notice sat a gnome on a toadstool with a fishing rod in his hand, with the line dangling in midair. Liza knew he was a gnome because Aunt Edwina had one just like him in her garden. "What a funny notice," she said out loud. "What's funny about it?" said the gnome. A little taken aback, Liza said, "Well, I've never heard of careful singers. Where I come from, they always welcome careful drivers." "Not much point in that here," said the gnome. "There aren't any cars. No use welcoming careful drivers if they got nothing to drive. I suppose you're from back there." And he jerked his thumb in the direction from which Liza had just come. She nodded. "Ah," said the gnome. "That accounts for it. Anyway, I hope you're a careful singer, are you?" he added rather aggressively. "I don't know," confessed Liza. "I've never really thought about it." "Well, it's high time you did," said the gnome truculently. "We don't want any loose A-sharps or G-flats cluttering up the place. There's enough litter about as it is. You better give me a demonstration. Go on, sing me a song." "I don't see why I should," said Liza defiantly. "Well, I do," said the gnome. "Go on, get on with it. Any old song will do as long as it's the land of hope and morning glory." I don't know about the morning bit," said Liza with great dignity, "so I shall leave that out." "Oh, very well," said the gnome huffily. "Have it your own way. Just as long as you get on with it." Liza took a deep breath, drew herself up to her full height, and started to sing. After a few bars, the gnome interrupted her. That's enough, he said. "You do. Which way do you want to go?" he added, as he got down from his toadstool. And for the first time, Liza noticed that through the archway the road divided into dozens of different directions. "I've really no idea," she said. "Which way would you recommend?" "Depends on what you want," said the gnome airily. "All roads lead to Rome." And so saying, he disappeared into a little hut and reappeared with a packet of sandwiches and an official-looking book. "Well, if all roads lead to Rome, it doesn't really matter which one I take, does it?" said Liza reasonably. "Figure of speech, child, figure of speech," said the gnome testily. "You're not very well educated, are you?" As Liza opened her mouth to protest, he added quickly, "Do you want to see the king?" "Oh, that would be lovely," said Liza, clapping her hands. "I've never seen one of those." "They're all much of a muchness," said the gnome, thrusting the book at her. "Right. Pass, friend, and sign the counterfoil." Liza signed her name with a flourish, and the gnome jerked his thumb in the direction of the middle road. "That way," he said, and started to munch his sandwiches, taking no further notice of Liza, who stepped out briskly along the middle road. She walked on and on and on until she began to feel extremely tired, and then, Seeing what looked like a milestone beside the road, she decided to sit down on it and rest for a while. Bending down, she inspected what was written on the stone and saw that, pointing in the direction in which she was going, it read 36 leagues to somewhere. And pointing in the direction from which she had just come, it said 36 leagues to nowhere. Very odd, thought Liza. I don't even know what a league is. I only know about kilometers. Just at that moment, from out of a little side road that she had noticed, there came a hen, carrying a shopping basket. The hen studied the stone for a moment and then looked at Liza and asked, "Which way are you going?" "Good gracious," exclaimed Liza. "You can talk." "Well, of course I can talk," said the hen. "Why should that surprise you? You can talk, can't you? Answer me that." "Yes," said Liza, "but that's different." "Why is it?" demanded the hen in a sharp tone. "You're all alike, you human beings. You think you're the only ones who can do anything. Good heavens! How do you think I could communicate if I couldn't talk? Answer me that." Liza felt incapable of doing any such thing and said rather lamely, "I thought you clucked." "Clucked!" screeched the hen on a rising note of indignation. "Clucked! How do you think one could communicate by clucking? Answer me that." "Oh, well, I don't really know," faltered Liza. "I've never really thought about it." "No," said the hen fiercely. "That's just the trouble with people. They never do think. Anyway, I asked you where you were going. Answer me that." "Well," said Liza, pointing at the stone, "I seem to have come from nowhere, so I think I'd like to go somewhere." "A sensible decision," said the hen, calming down and nodding approval. "That's where I'm going too, so we can go together." And so saying, she picked up her basket and started off in the direction of the arrow. Liza ran after her. "How far," she asked, puffing a little bit, "is a league?" "Why, it's just as long as you want it to be, of course," retorted the hen. "Really, where were you educated?" "I think you're the rudest hen I've ever met," exploded Liza. "And how many have you met?" demanded the hen. "Answer me that! There you are, you can't, so come along and don't waste any more time. I'm in a hurry to get to the market, so I'm going to make a league very short, about 6 meters, in fact. You can do as you please." And she strode off ahead again. "Oh, yes," cried Liza, running after her. "I'm getting very tired. I'd like it to be short, too." "Well, here we are then," said the hen. And they rounded a bend in the road, and there before them was a huge, bustling marketplace, full of stalls piled high with all kinds of fruit and flowers and vegetables and sweets and cakes, and all manner of delicious-looking things. Crowds of gnomes and birds of every description were busy doing their shopping and chattering excitedly to one another as they went about their business. Gasped Liza, "they can all talk." "Well, of course they can," said the hen in an exasperated manner. "Communication, remember? Oh, really?" it went on. "Soon you'll be telling me you didn't know potatoes could walk." "But I didn't," spluttered Liza in amazement. "Anyway, I must get on with my shopping. I'll have 1.5 pounds of potatoes," it added, to no one in particular. And before Liza's astonished gaze, a whole row of potatoes rose from the stall and sauntered into the hen's waiting basket. Don't push, cried the hen. "There's plenty of room for you all. Just settle down now and stop fighting." But they actually do walk," stammered Liza. The hen withered her with a glance. "You're not very good at believing things, are you?" it said. "It must be that faulty education of yours." "Well, come along if you're coming," it added. "I haven't got all day." "Where are we going?" asked Liza. "I know where I'm going," snapped the hen, "but I've no idea about you. You said you wanted to see the king. Now do you or don't you? Answer me that." "Yes, I do," said Liza, "but I don't know how to get there." "Neither do I," said the hen, "so you better consult someone. I should think the Wizard of Wuz would be the best person." "The Wizard of Wuz?" repeated Liza. "Yes," cackled the hen. "He used to be the Wizard of Iz, but he's a bit past it now." "Yes, but how do I get to him?" persisted Liza. "You take a carpet, of course," said the hen shortly. "A carpet?" said Liza in surprise. "Of course," repeated the hen. "Oh, come along, do. I've had enough of your stupidity for one day." And so saying, she vanished round the corner. Liza followed her huffily. She didn't feel that she was at all stupid. It was just that everything seemed strange in this country of Garlandia. When she rounded the corner, she found the hen standing at the head of a long, straggly line of chickens and ducks, turkeys and pheasants, and all kinds of other birds, including a gaggle of little tiny ducklings and a cluster of baby yellow chicks, all of them pushing and shoving each other about in a boisterous way. The hen produced a sign from her basket and stood it on the pavement. It read, "Carpet, stop." Then the hen produced another sign which read, "Next carpet at," above a huge clock with movable hands. "When do you want the carpet to come?" she called out. "Well, when's it due?" asked Liza reasonably. "Whatever has that got to do with it?" asked the hen, getting aggressive again. "Really, this phobia you have for precise measurements and precise times, I do find it terribly tedious." "Then I'd like it to come now," shouted Liza, who was getting in a temper. "Well then, why ever didn't you say so?" said the hen calmly, "instead of all that messing about. Really, you do complicate things." And she moved the hand on the clock to point to the word now. Liza was about to protest indignantly when around the corner swooped a flying carpet, which seemed to be made of strands of every imaginable colored thread plaited together. It was being driven by a drake, and the conductor was a large duck wearing a badge saying, "I am your conductor." All aboard quickly, and make haste about it," shouted the duck, and all the birds tumbled into the middle except for the baby ducklings and chicks who hung on to the fringe round the edges. "They're half-fed," explained the hen to Liza. "Now then," called the duck, "hold very tight, please," and rang a bell, whereupon the drake immediately put the carpet into overdrive, so that it shot off like a rocket, and all the baby ducks and chicks who'd failed to heed the instructions to hold very tight immediately fell off. "Loop-de-loop!" yelled the conductor duck, and the carpet went soaring down underneath the falling baby birds, scooped them up, and continued on its way. All was peaceful for a little while, and then the conductor announced, "We're coming into turbulence. Please fasten your safety strands." And all the birds plucked up a strand from the weave of the carpet and hung on to it, except for the baby birds, who huddled together in one corner, hanging on to each other. All of a sudden, the carpet hit an air pocket and jerked upwards, whereupon all the baby birds went overboard again. But as they were all hanging on to each other, and as one of them was hanging onto the carpet, they floated out in line astern, and the carpet looked for all the world like a kite with a very long tail. "Stop!" yelled the conductor, and the drake slammed on the brakes, whereupon the carpet stood still and the bird tail rushed forward and overtook it, and the baby birds were hauled back on board again. What an adventurous journey, Liza was thinking when the duck came up to her and said, "Fares, please." How much is it to the Wizard of Woz?" "How should I know?" retorted the duck. "How much have you got?" "Oh dear, I hope we're not going to start all that again," sighed Liza, and at that moment she remembered that she had not got any money on her anyway. "I'm afraid I haven't actually got any money," she said apologetically. "Well, what have you got?" demanded the duck. "What's that bulge in your pocket?" "It's a packet of jelly babies," said Liza, dragging it out. "Well, let's say 2 jelly babies to the Wizard of Woz," said the duck, and Liza proffered them up. "Thank you," said the duck, handing her a ticket. "I'll just make you out your bill." "But I don't need a bill for a bus ticket," protested Liza. "You most certainly do," retorted the conductor. "This is a duck-billed planted bus." At that moment there was a sudden bump, and the duck announced, "This is your stop now," and the carpet came to a shuddering halt. "Anyone for the Wizard of Woz?" he called, but Liza seemed to be the only one getting off. She looked around her. The landscape was completely empty as far as the eye could see. She turned for help to the hen. "There's nothing here," she said. "Well, for goodness sake," snapped the hen, "use a little initiative. Don't just stand there, wish for a wizard." And so saying, she clanged the bell and the carpet shot off with all its customers clinging to it. Without much confidence in the outcome, Liza closed her eyes and said, "I wish the Wizard of Woz was here." Then she opened her eyes, and there wasn't a wizard in sight. Then, in the sky, she noticed a small speck, far, far away, which seemed to be getting larger and larger. And as it got nearer, she saw that it was a small wooden house, covered in climbing plants, which was whirling down towards her. It came to earth with a thump. The front door opened and out stepped an old gentleman dressed in a long black cloak covered with sparkling stars. "Are you the Wizard of Was?" asked Liza anxiously.
"At your service, madam," replied the wizard with a low bow. "What can I do for you?"
"Well," said Liza, "I came to ask if you could take me to the king. But I've had such an exciting and confusing day that I'm getting terribly tired, and now I think I'd really rather go home."
"A very wise decision," said the wizard. "Kings are 10 a penny. East, west, home's best," he added unctuously.
"Could you possibly," asked Liza timidly, "show me the way to go home?"
"Easy peasy," said the wizard,
and he plucked a morning glory from the hat.
"Just smell that."
So Liza drew a deep breath, and once again she felt the trickle of pollen in her nostrils. And all of a sudden, there was a smell, and it was the delicious smell of rock buns. The blue trumpet grew and grew until she could step through it, and once on the other side she forgot all about Garlandia as she raced toward Aunt Edwina's kitchen, her mouth already watering at the thought of the gorgeous golden-brown, crisp, crumbly, currant-laden little cakes which were awaiting her there.
Maladroit, the magician who meant well. Read by Hannah Gordon.
Once upon a time, there was a magician. Well, of course, once upon a time, there were masses of magicians. Once upon a time, magicians were a ducat a dozen, and anyone wanting a quick bit of abracadabra had only to ruffle through the golden pages to find miles and miles of magicians. But this particular magician was renowned far and wide. This was because he was quite exceptionally inefficient. He was the court magician to the kingdom of King Cuthbert the Clumsy, and his name was Maladroit. The queen, who had married a bit above herself, and whose H's were apt to fall like the gentle rain from heaven upon any old word beneath when she put on her posh voice, was wont to introduce him with the remark, "He understand he emanates from foreign parts. Anyway, we just call him Mally." As a recipe for total disaster, Cuthbert and Maladroit made an unbeatable combination. Cuthbert consistently doing irreparable damage to irreplaceable objects, usually in other people's palaces, and Mally, in his attempts to repair the damage by magic, effortlessly turning disaster into chaos. Needless to say, all the royal children absolutely adored him and jumped for joy every time he messed up his magic. "How easy is a bush supposed a bear?" he would murmur, wafting his wand about, and the bush would instantly turn into a beetle, whereupon the royal children would clap their hands and shriek, "Do it again, Mally!" And Mally would repeat the spell, at which the beetle would be transformed into a blancmange, and the royal children would clutch their stomachs and roll on the ground with glee. There was one occasion when, trying to turn Princess Dulcie's hair from blonde to red, he actually made her nose grow instead, and it continued to grow until it became so heavy she was forced to lie face down on the ground until he was able to reverse the spell. It took him 3 days to get it back to normal again. Perhaps, not unnaturally, Princess Dulcie adored him somewhat less than the other children. The one who adored him most was Princess Lizzie, who, while taking good care to steer well clear of his magic, would confide to him all her troubles and secrets. So when she was 18, she confessed to him how much in love she was with Prince Jeremy of Upper Crustasia. "But oh, Mally," she sighed, "his mother's frightfully snooty, and I bet she won't think I'm good enough for him." Sure enough, at that moment in Upper Crustasia, Prince Jeremy's petition to his parents was falling on fairly stony ears. "I'm sure the girl's a nice enough little thing,"
Queen Patricia was saying. "But really, dear, her mother." She let the words hang in the air a moment, and then put the boot in. "She comes," she said, "from Lower Crustacea." "That girl, Lillian of Languidia, is more the type I'd like you to pay attention to," went on Patricia. "She's very well bred and very beautiful." "She's very wet," said Jeremy. "All the chaps call her Languid Lil." "You shouldn't talk about a young princess like that," said his father reprovingly. "Now, I must admit," he added fairly, "if you put her 3 times through the mangle, she'd still come out a bit moist." "Hector," said Patricia, "come with me." And she stalked off to her boudoir. "I've thought a way out of this," she said. "We'll have Jeremy's bride chosen by a beauty competition. Then Prince Lillian is bound to win. We could hold a Princess World contest with a panel of independent judges from all walks of life," she went on, getting a bit carried away. "Very well, my dear," said Hector, "if that's what you want." "It is," said the Queen, which meant it was decided. Meanwhile, knowing nothing of these machinations, and in the expectation of an imminent engagement between Jeremy and Lizzie, King Cuthbert and Queen Gladioli, commonly known as Glad, had invited the upper crusts to dinner. "I think I'll give him lark's tongues on toast for starters," Glad was musing, when Cuthbert cut in. "You know that vase they gave us for our anniversary?" "Yes, Cuth, you broke it," said Glad, who was busy turning some old coronation robes side to middle. "I think we should put it on display when they visit us," went on Cuthbert, "and don't call me Cuth." "You broke it, Cuth," repeated Glad calmly, as she snapped off a length of gold thread with her teeth. "Oh, this ermine's getting ever so tatty. I think I'll go in for the imitation Nylene furlong next time." "I don't know why you bother with things like that," said the King testily. "We've got plenty of money for new ones. And don't call me Cuth," he added automatically. "Yes, dear, but many a mickle makes muckle, as my old dad used to say. Mind you, we never knew what he meant by it, but that's what he used to say. And you broke that vase, Cuth. You know you did." "Yes, of course I broke it. You know I always break vases, but Mally could magic up a new one in a trice." "Fat chance," said Glad bitterly. "He's more likely to magic up a cut-glass chamber pot instead." When the problem was put to him, Mally shuffled absent-mindedly through teach-yourself sorcery, muttering, "Oh, let me see, vase, vase, vase. I wonder what that comes under." "Not the bed," said Glad tartly. Oh, no, never mind," she added, seeing his look of bafflement. "Just get on with it and do something." So Mally got on with it and did something. In quick succession he produced a violin, a vacuum cleaner, and a vulture. Tut-tutting between each mistake, he turned to A Beginner's Guide to Alchemy, swished again with his wand, and suddenly produced a perfect replica of the cut-glass vase. "Mally, that's marvellous," said the King, and reaching out to grab it, let it slip through his grasp and smash to smithereens on the flagstone floor. "Cuthbert fingers," sighed the Queen. "Never mind," cried Mally. "I've got the hang of it now." And swishing away, he produced 6 more vases. That'll do," said the Queen hastily. "We'll put 5 in the cellar out of your way, Cuth, and the other one here in the hall, so as they'll see it as they come in." And indeed, when the upper crusts arrived, it was the first thing they spotted. "Good Lord, old man," said Hector. "Don't tell me you've still got that vase. I thought you'd have broken it ages ago." At which Cuthbert, tripping over the mat as he rushed forward to greet them, had the grace to look a little shamefaced. "Now then," said Glad, "about the kiddies." "If you mean that childish infatuation between Jeremy and your gal," said Patricia, "I'm afraid nothing can come of that. In our family, the elder son's bride is always chosen by a beauty contest. It's an old upper crustacean custom, you know." "Since when?" muttered Glad darkly, but she knew when she was beaten. After the visitors had gone, she turned to the king. "What are we going to do, Cuth? Our Lizzie's a pretty enough gal, but she'll never beat the likes of that Lilium of Languidia." At which the king, flinging out his arm in a gesture of despair, knocked over the upper-class vase. "Oh, well," he remarked philosophically, "no need to bother bringing up another one from the cellar now. And as for our Lizzie, how about a spot of magic?"
"From Mally?" screeched Glad. "Not Pygmalion lightly. And anyway, you know that instant magic beauty never lasts long. After a bit you have to go back for another spell or two to take up the slack."
It seemed, in any case, that Queen Patricia had prepared for this contingency, for when the competition was announced, "No magical improvements allowed," was clearly printed on the entry forms. Princess Lizzie, however, had an idea. News of the contest had naturally caused a flutter in every royal dovecot for leagues around. But after she'd sized up the opposition, she'd come to the conclusion that Languid Lil was her only real rival, and she'd taken Mally aside and put a proposition to him. "I don't want an improvement," she said, "but do you think, Mally, that the day before the contest you could turn me into a mule? Only temporarily, mind you," she added hastily, "and then I could give that droopy girl a kick or two. Just little ones, you know, not really to hurt her, but just enough to nobble her so that she doesn't come under starter's orders." "Nothing simpler, my dear," beamed Mally. "There's a very good mule spell in the Infant's Book of Incantations. I've used it many times." "Successfully?" asked Lizzie, at which Mally suddenly succumbed to a ferocious fit of coughing. Though Lizzie had a few qualms about the outcome, it was the best solution that she could think of. So, the day before the contest, when all the entrants and their entourages were housed in the guest wing of the upper-crust palace, she drew a deep breath, clenched her teeth, and waited for Mally to do his worst. "Eye of newt and wing of flea, transformed for half an hour you'll be." Whereupon the Princess Lizzie vanished. But no mule appeared in her place. In fact, nothing appeared in her place except a high-pitched buzzing sound, and Mally collapsed in a crumpled heap of disappointment. "I'm getting past it," he murmured. "It's time I retired." When half an hour was up, however, Lizzie suddenly reappeared, with what, if she hadn't been such a nice girl, would have looked like a satisfied smirk on her face. She flung her arms around Maladroit and gave him a smacking kiss. "Bless you for bungling, Mally dear," she dimpled, and danced off to collect her competition sash. The contest the next day was really, as King Cuthbert rather vulgarly put it, just a one-horse race. All sorts of assorted princesses paraded round and round the ornamental fountain in the centre of the courtyard, but they were a pretty plain lot, as princesses principally are, with the exception of Princess Lizzie, who was absolutely radiant. As for Lilian of Languidia, she just looked like one large lump, or, on closer inspection, lots and lots of little lumps, or more precisely, masses and masses of mosquito bites. It's pretty difficult to be beautiful if you're bitten to bits, and Lilian hadn't managed it. Queen Patricia bitterly regretted having appointed a panel of independent judges, because she felt that left to herself, she would probably have found a way to avoid the inevitable decision. But being undeniably upper crust, she gave in gracefully, and putting a brave face on it, announced Lizzie the winner. Whereupon Jeremy and Lizzie fell into each other's arms, and Cuthbert, hurrying forward to congratulate them, fell into the fountain. "Welcome to the family, dear," murmured Patricia as she placed the crown on Lizzie's head. "And do try not to copy the way your mother holds her knife and fork." But Lizzie was looking round anxiously. "Where's Mally?" she asked. "I must thank him for his help." a voice spoke from just above her right shoulder.
"Actually, I'm here," said the voice. "But I've had a slight mishap. For a long time I've been trying to find a formula to improve my efficiency, and I thought I'd find it, so I took a swig, but it seems to be a formula for invisibility instead. However," went on the voice, "there is an antidote in that bottle on the battlements, just by His Majesty."
King Cuthbert reached out and picked up the bottle. "Put it down, Cuth," said Glad urgently. "Put it down!" "Why should I?" asked Cuthbert, wafting the bottle about. "I know where it's been." "Yes, and I know where it's going," sighed Glad resignedly. She was quite right, of course. The bottle slipped straight through his fingers and crashed with a clatter on the concrete. "Oh dear," said Cuthbert. "Sorry, Mally, but I'm sure you've got some more of the stuff." There was a very long pause before the disembodied voice of Maladroit said, with a certain hesitation, "Well, no, I haven't actually. Though I dare say I'll find the formula again in time. But meanwhile," the voice added in tones of intended regret, which were heavily overlaid with relief, "I really don't mind, that I can continue to be court magician while I'm invisible. It would really do inconvenient. I've been wanting to resign for some time now, but I didn't like to let you down." "You mean," breathed Glad, grasping at this glittering prize, "that you'll actually resign because you're invisible?"
"Well, yes, but, oh dear, my conscience won't let me deceive you," said the voice, dropping into deep despondency. "I must confess that there is another bottle of antidote in my sponge bag."
"Cuthbert," said Glad with a gleam in her eye, "go and get it at once." "Yes, dear," said Cuthbert, hurrying off. A few seconds after his footsteps had faded, there came the inevitable sound of breaking glass.
"Ah, well,"
said Mally, relief flooding his voice.
"Back to the Ouija board."
But it didn't sound as though he was going back to it very quickly. When the king came back, covered with antidote, Queen Glad flung her arms around his neck. "Oh, you are clever, Cuth," she cried. "Now we can all live happily ever after."
"Yes, dear," said the king. "Don't call me Cuth."
More Apple Tree Adventures, read by Liza Goddard.
Jimmy was walking wearily home from school. He was dragging not only his toes in the dust, but a large bundle of books behind him. The books contained his homework, and Jimmy was not happy about it.
"Rotten arithmetic," he groaned. "Awful algebra, ghastly geometry."
Jimmy was not mathematically minded.
"I don't understand any of it. I'm not going to be able to do this homework. All those questions about two trains coming towards each other at different speeds and bathtubs filling at different rates and how many degrees in an isosceles triangle. Great grumbling gorillas," he groaned, as he pushed open the back gate and began to make his way up the garden. "I think I'd do better to run away to sea and forget about school altogether."
He was just passing under the apple tree as he spoke, and a falling apple fell smack on his head, and a rustly voice said above his head,
"Less of that rubbish. You had better sit down and do a bit of thinking. You might at last learn something."
"Oh, apple tree," gasped Jimmy. "I had forgotten about you."
"It doesn't do to forget about apple trees,"
said the apple tree severely. Some time before, Jimmy had discovered that not only could the apple tree talk, but that if he sat and rubbed his back against it, it would grant him wishes if he said the right rhyme. The adventures he had had on that occasion had made him a bit wary of the apple tree, and he had tended to give it a wide berth ever since. But now he realised it could come in very useful. No need to run away to sea. The apple tree could just turn him into something else.
"Why are you thinking of running away to sea?"
demanded the apple tree, as Jimmy settled himself comfortably against its bole. "Well," said Jimmy, "I've got the most horrible homework, and I didn't understand anything of the lesson in class today."
"What did they teach you?"
asked the apple tree.
"Or try to teach you?"
it said sarcastically. Jimmy repeated parrot fashion. "The square on the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle is equal to the sum of the squares on the two adjacent sides, and a fat lot of good that's going to be to me when I grow up," he added bitterly.
"You never know," admonished the apple tree. "Although," it went on reasonably, "in all fairness, I can think of somewhat more useful information that might have been imparted to you."
"Me too," said Jimmy firmly.
"What you mean is so also can I," corrected the apple tree. "I remember that your grammar was always appalling, and I see that it has not improved."
"Sorry," said Jimmy hastily. "Now do you think I could have a wish or two?" There was a long pause, and then finally the tree pronounced,
"Only if you promise to put your experiences to good use and forget all that rubbish about running away to sea."
"I promise," said Jimmy eagerly. At that particular moment he would have promised to walk on his hands on a tightrope across Niagara Falls if it would have got him out of doing his homework.
"Very well, then," said the tree. "Settle down. Are you sitting comfortably?"
it asked conventionally. Jimmy nodded.
"All right, then. You may begin."
Apple tree, listen to me. I wish I was—"
"Oh, my sainted boughs and branches!" exploded the tree. "Don't you ever remember anything you're taught?"
Jimmy hastily corrected himself. "I wish I were," he continued, and he looked up into the sky for inspiration and saw the birds wheeling and swooping about, and he thought what fun it would be to fly. "A bird," he finished firmly, and before you could say, "Annie's your auntie," he found himself perched precariously on the topmost bough of the tallest pine tree in the far-off forest. He felt extremely small and extremely lonely. He looked around him. There seemed an awful lot of sky. All of a sudden, there was a rush of wind and a flutter of wings, and he saw that a small chaffinch had settled down on the bough beside him. "Lovely weather we're having for the time of year," chirruped the chaffinch chirpily, and Jimmy, whose head was reeling from the height, did not trust himself to speak, but, clinging onto the branch with his claws, just nodded. "Oh, well, can't stay here all day listening to your chatter," chirped the chaffinch a bit unfairly. "I've got eggs to lay and beak to feed. Must get home and do the nest work." And so saying, it spread its wings and flew off into the blue. Jimmy watched it in desperation, wondering whether he would ever have the courage to let go of the branch and launch himself into space. He looked down, and the earth seemed 1,000,000 miles away. He shuddered, but just at that moment a great gust of wind blew and shook the branch so hard that Jimmy lost his balance and found himself falling, faster and faster and faster, and the ground that was coming up to meet him got nearer and nearer every split second. "You're a bird," thought Jimmy frantically, "so try to fly." And he stretched out what would have been his arms, but which were now wings, and immediately his downward drop stopped, and he started to soar along level with the ground, which really was incredibly close. Jimmy heaved the equivalent of a bird's sigh of relief and just kept on floating through the air. Suddenly he saw he was heading straight for a huge oak tree. "Great meddling monkeys!" he exclaimed. "Now what do I do?" In a panic he started to flap his arms up and down, and he lifted his head to look up at the tree, and as he did so, his whole bird body changed direction, and he was flying upwards at an angle, and he swooped effortlessly over the tree. "Got it," he thought triumphantly. "Wings up and down for propulsion, head up or down for direction." And he suddenly remembered that when he'd been a fish, he could turn to the left or the right by flipping one or other of his fins. He thought probably the same thing applied to flying. So, experimentally, he gave a terrific flap with his right wing and immediately turned in such a tight circle that he almost bit his tail off. "Easy does it," he thought, and continued to experiment, but a good deal more gently. And soon he was swooping and gliding and sprinting through the sky, and looking down at the tiny earth below, he thought how boring it was for human beings who could only clump along clumsily on their 2 flat feet. After a while, though, he felt his wings begin to tire, and he thought he would take a rest. Spying a nearby tree, he thought he would sit on one of its boughs for a while. So coming alongside it, he attempted to land on the nearest one, but he was flying so fast he overshot it by several centimetres. To his fury, he heard a bellow of bird laughter coming from a thrush who was already sitting there.
"Missed it by a mile,"
giggled the thrush gaily. Jimmy was affronted. He hadn't been as far off as all that. Wheeling round, he approached the branch again. He gritted his beak, stretched out his claws, and clutching at a twig, clung onto it like a barnacle to a boat's bottom. "A perfect 3-point landing," he puffed.
"Oh, come off it," twittered the thrush. "You just about made it, mate, so don't exaggerate. As you seem to be a bit of a beginner," he conceded, "I'll give you some more room."
And so saying, he budged up the branch. Jimmy spread his wings, which balanced him, and panted, "Thanks."
"Don't mention it,"
said the thrush, and burst into song. "Great swelling swallows," mused Jimmy. "I hadn't thought. I'm a bird, so I can sing." This was a novelty to him. Whenever he sang at school, all the rest of the music class stuffed their fingers in their ears. But now, "I can sing," he crowed confidently, and he opened his beak and gave forth. What came out was cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. A person passing by beneath the tree paused, listened, pulled out a diary from his pocket, and made a note in it. The next day he wrote to the Times to say that he had heard the first cuckoo of spring. As the month was January, this constituted a record which will probably never be broken. In the branches above, Jimmy continued to cry, "Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo," over and over again. The thrush looked at him in distaste.
"Oh, turn the record over," it said. "Can't you sing another song?"
"Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo," continued Jimmy, till the thrush shrugged its wings and said,
"Of all the boring birds, you take the beak," and flew off.
Jimmy felt a bit lonely, so when he had got his breath back, he flew off too. He swooped around in the sky and could not help feeling a bit abandoned. "Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo," he called disconsolately. His wings were starting to ache again with the effort of flying so far, when he saw, lodged in the crook of 2 branches of a nearby tree, a lovely, cosy-looking nest. He sped towards it like an arrow from a bow and settled himself comfortably down, contentedly concentrating on getting his breath back. "This is the life," he thought, looking happily around him. "A ready-built home with all mod cons." And then he heard a furious squawk from the sky above him, and looking up saw 2 furious birds descending on him like dive bombers.
"Get out of our nest,"
they hissed. Jimmy just had time to reflect that he had never heard a bird hiss before when they were almost upon him. He was frozen with fright.
"We'll peck out your eyes,"
screeched the male bird.
"We'll pluck out your tail,"
screamed its mate. Jimmy felt that he did not care for this programme at all, but the 2 furies were now so close that his only means of escape was just to fall sideways out of the nest and drop like a stone until he could gain control of his wings again. The moment he did so, he flapped them like mad, but the birds were still pursuing him downwards, and turning to look over his wing, he saw that they were gaining on him every split second. "There's nothing for it but to change myself," he thought desperately, and looking down he saw a little field mouse scuttling into the hedge. Apple tree, listen to me, squeaked Jimmy in a frenzy of fear. I wish I were a mouse. And instantly the world became black. All around him was darkness, and Jimmy wondered wherever he could be. He started to move around and found that he went pitter-patter on little tiny feet, and suddenly he felt himself brush up against something. But it wasn't his body that made contact. It was his whiskers. Jumping Jehoshaphat, I really am a mouse, he said, and went on wondering where he could be. Very cautiously he went forward into the darkness, and whenever his whiskers brushed against something, he altered his angle and made off in a different direction. Suddenly he saw a little circle of light in the distance, and hurriedly he scuttled towards it. It got bigger and bigger as he got nearer and nearer, and at last he realised that it was a mouse hole, and that he in fact was inside it. I wonder what is on the other side, he said, as he squeezed through it. And lo and behold, he found himself in the familiar surroundings of his school classroom. Well, I'll be blowed, he squeaked in a high-pitched tone. I'm that mouse that some of the boys keep throwing their rubbers at. And he felt a flush of virtue in remembering that he had never done that. Well, at least I know my way around here. But isn't everything enormous? He gazed up at what looked like the trunk of a gigantic tree, and suddenly realised that it was the leg of the form master's desk. Jimmy had seen the mouse run up desk legs many a time, and thought he'd like to give it a go. He took a mighty flying leap, landed on the leg, clung on, and then began to clamber up. Wow, he squeaked. I'm climbing at a 90-degree angle from the earth. I could run up clocks or walls or ladies' skirts or any old thing. But at that moment, he reached the top of the leg and landed on the desk lid. There before him stood what looked like a mountain of paper. Jimmy scrambled up onto the top of it and gazed down at a sheet with writing on it, and realised that these were the class's history essays, and that his was on the very top. He knew that his history essay had not been very good, and he appreciated the fact that fate had delivered him the opportunity to do something about it. With his sharp little front teeth, he set to work with a will, and he munched huge holes in the paper, till his history essay looked more like a bag of confetti than pages from an exercise book. Well, that's a good day's work done, he said to himself, with a satisfied, mousy smirk, and he jumped down from the desk leg and landed with a plop on the floor, where, to his terrified horror, he found himself face to face with the school cat. For a split second, he froze, and then he got his little legs into action and beat it as fast as they would carry him towards his hole. The cat's paws came thundering after him, and he could feel the cat's breath, smelling somewhat of sardines, uncomfortably close to his neck. The mouse hole was in sight, and Jimmy made a last desperate leap towards it, and so did the cat, who landed with a thump against the wainscot as Jimmy slid through the hole to safety. Once inside, though, the situation still remained desperate. The cat glued its eye to the hole and glared in at Jimmy, who stood trembling inside. As a boy, he had often seen the cat do this from the other side of the hole, and knew that he could keep it up indefinitely. Help, however, was at hand, in the shape of the school cook, who Jimmy suddenly heard calling far off, "Tibbles, Tibbles, Tibbles, time for your dinner." The cat appeared to consider. He couldn't get into the hole because it wasn't big enough, and if he stayed waiting outside too long, he might miss his dinner. "Better a plate of kitty-cat in the hand than a mouse in the bush," he appeared to say to himself, and he sauntered off towards the kitchen. Jimmy gave him plenty of time to get away before he dared venture out again. His idea was to put as much space between himself and the schoolroom before the cat came back, but he felt decidedly peckish and felt he ought to fortify himself before setting off on his journey. He looked around him. Sometimes boys dropped sweets on the floor and were too scared to pick them up with the master's gaze upon them, but there wasn't a sweet to be seen. What there was, though, and the sight made his heart lift, was a large piece of cheese. Jimmy adored cheese even as a boy, and much more so as a mouse. It seemed to be lying on some kind of platform, and Jimmy made his way eagerly towards it. He put his 2 front paws up on the platform and gently began to nibble the nearest morsel of cheese. It was delicious, and he was just going to take a much bigger bite when he suddenly glanced up and saw, poised above his head, a gigantic hoop of wire which was already beginning to descend upon him.
"Oh, blubbering baboons!"
he squealed.
"It's a mousetrap!"
And he turned to run, but not quickly enough, because the metal arc came down with an almighty snap on the end of his tail. He kept on running for the door with the trap attached to his tail, and suddenly he heard out in the yard a distinct meow. The cat was coming back.
"Great honking horns!" he groaned. "I'm between a cat and a mousetrap, and that can't be good."
And expanding his little lungs to their outmost, he squeaked out,
Apple tree, listen to me. I wish I were a boy again."
And all of a sudden, there he was, sitting panting at the base of the apple tree, with his school books still strewn around him. He sighed heartily.
"Now, what's the matter?"
asked the apple tree. Jimmy sighed again and said, "I've been through the most frightful experiences, and I'm still back here with all this prep to do."
"Don't whinge," said the apple tree severely. "Use your experience. Think, in as far as you're capable of thinking," it added caustically.
Jimmy thought. He remembered the downward velocity at which he flew when he was a bird. He remembered the speed at which he fled from the cat when he was a mouse. And he also remembered the twists and turns and all the different degrees of angles that he took while he was escaping. With the personal experience of speed and distance and direction, he could understand the mathematical problems in his prep. He counted and he calculated, and suddenly he saw the solution. All kinds of conundrums became clear. "Yippee!" he yelled, and did a spirited impression of Professor Higgins. "I think I've got it! By Jove, I've got it! I've really got it!" And he pranced around the garden with a great big grin on his face. Although he didn't actually feel that he could have danced all night, he did feel decidedly chipper, and could definitely have done a twirl or two. He grabbed up his books from the base of the tree and dashed indoors, colliding with his mother in the doorway. "Good gracious," cried his mother. "What are you in such a hurry about?" "I'm going to do my homework," said Jimmy over his shoulder. "Heavens to Betsy!" exclaimed his mother, who watched a lot of old American movies. "You've never been in such a hurry to do it before." "Well," said Jimmy, "I've never been a mouse before." His mother shook her head. "What are you talking about?" she said. "Sometimes I really don't know what to make of you. I can't think what you're going to be when you grow up." "I can tell you something," said Jimmy. "I'm not going to be a bird or a mouse." "I should certainly hope not," said his mother, shutting the sitting room door with a snap, and so allowing Jimmy to finish his prep in perfect peace.